This video is sponsored by Skillshare. More to come on that shortly. Well, Crofty, here we are again on another swelteringly hot British evening. People think it's cold in Britain. I can assure you it's not. We've just come off a week of it being just absolutely like up in the like high 20s, low 30s where I am.
And about the same where I am, but I'm very glad today that I get basically no direct sunlight where I live.
Oh, congratulations. No, I'm sat instead in my tiny little office at the top of my house where all the heat likes to rise up to, so I expect fully over the course of this episode I will melt. Hello everybody, welcome to Mythological, the podcast about all things mythical and folklore. So yeah, we were promised a little bit of a break in the weather. We were told last week that it's going to be rubbish this week, and we all thought, phew, that's going to be nice, have a nice cool week. And then that just didn't happen. So, I don't know about you, Crofty, but everyone around where I am is just like, we were on a break.
Yeah, that sounds about right here as well. Yeah. We had one day of rain, but it didn't stick, which is strange for Wales.
But what better to do than on a ridiculously hot summer's day to talk about a creature that lives in nice, temperate North Pacific forest.
And who would that creature be, Charles?
Exactly. So, Crofty, we're going to try and get into it today. I know we have a bit of a habit on this show having long introductions. Spoiler warning, folks, this is going to be a long one. It's going to be a two-parter, and both parts of this could be quite long. And that might be explained by the subject of today's episode. So, Crofty, do you want to tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
Yes, today we're going to be talking about Bigfoot, also known as the Sasquatch, probably the most famous cryptid in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to come down to that and a Loch Ness Monster, I think, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the main thing Bigfoot has going for it over Nessie is that there's generally thought to be more than one, and also its similarity in many ways to humans that draws a lot of enthusiasts to the field of Bigfoot hunting and cryptozoology in general.
Yeah, it has the human element, so to speak.
Exactly.
So we knew going in that this thing was going to be long, so we split it into a two-parter, and now it looks like both those episodes are now going to be long as well, unfortunately. And that's because there is a staggering amount of claimed evidence associated with Bigfoot that, in my case, stretch back to as far as the late 16th century. However, the key word there, and that we're going to stress going forward in this episode, is the word claimed. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence that we're going to be talking through today. So, Crofty, I think it's only fair then that we start out, as with all our episodes, by giving a quick summary of what, if for some reason you don't know, Bigfoot actually is, or is supposed to be.
Yes. As I've said, Bigfoot is in many ways thought to be quite similar to humans. He is a large humanoid hairy creature who is seen, or thought to be seen, throughout the Pacific Northwest of America, up as far north as the Canadian province of British Columbia, and as far south as California, and sometimes even been spotted as far east as the state of Arkansas.
Yeah, I think in the course of my reading I also came across an account of him in Hawaii, so I think it's pretty safe to say that Bigfoot has been reported pretty much everywhere in North America by this point.
I did not realise he holidayed in Hawaii.
No. But I'm surprised there isn't like a straight-to-DVD movie with Bigfoot in Hawaii, which, now the second I say that, I probably does actually exist now I think about it.
There has to be. I can just now picture one in a Hawaiian shirt, and it's like, nah.
Yeah. It unfortunately writes itself, and it's also a very bad writer. So, Crofty, that's his surface description. Do you want to give us a few more of his attributes?
Yes. Some people have tried to describe Bigfoot as possibly being the missing link between humans and apes, either in a biological sense, or for those with a more supernatural view of the creature in a spiritual sense, which will come up in one of the accounts later on. While exact descriptions do vary, he is always a very large, very muscular, bipedal creature who is covered in ape-like fur, but walking upright, and is generally claimed to have a human-like face. The height can range from 7 feet, or 210 centimetres, to 10 feet, or 305 centimetres, though there are one or two descriptions which even claim he is as tall as 15 feet, or 460 centimetres. Common sentiment when describing Bigfoot is that they are more human than animal, which is why hunters tend to be more interested in seeing them rather than in hunting and killing them. They're thought to live mostly in the forests and mountains, like I say, in the Pacific Northwestern US and the surrounding area. They are often alleged to make howling, screaming, or moaning sounds in the forest, though there have also been grunts and whistles reported that some claim are actually a form of language. There's also been described a very distinctive smell, with one person, Michael Rugg of the Bigfoot Museum in Northern California, describing this smell as, imagine a skunk that had rolled around in dead animals and hung around the garbage pits. I hope no one's eating the tea after I've described that.
That description has reminded me of all things when I was very young. I must have been 8 or 9 years old. A friend of mine, I was at a friend's house and he had a book called Big Fart. And I'm pretty certain I read it. I don't remember anything about it. But yeah, sorry, that little detail just came back and I could not help but share it.
I mean, I was slightly expecting you to insult this friend. It was this friend's house, and that's what he smelled like.
Oh, it was a joke book, so yeah.
I had one more serious thing to add to that description as well. The one final thing I was going to mention is quite obviously the footprints themselves, which are probably the most famous part of the entire Bigfoot story. They're usually the same or similar shaped to human prints, but around 16 inches long.
I got one small detail I can add to that as well, in more of the corners of Bigfoot advocacy that lean to more of a scientific approach. It is often claimed that foot is a perfectly flat foot rather than the arched foot that humans have.
Ah, yes. Sorry, I missed that.
No, not a problem.
Yeah, I was still recovering from Big Fart.
I think we all are in many ways.
This was a serious episode once.
So, Crofty, I remember going in thinking, we're going to take this seriously. We're not going to mock people's beliefs. We're going to look at this. And then we're already on Big Fart.
Yeah, we've ruined it there within 10 minutes.
But we're going on at length already. So, Crofty, what we're dealing with here, I think, is another of what we could put into the category of a modern myth. There's some argument that makes this myth much older that we will discuss, but the majority of major sightings associated with the Sasquatch or Bigfoot in what we would consider the modern sense only really happened in the course of the 20th century. So we're in kind of a similar territory to something like Spring-Heeled Jack that we did before, where at the heart of this myth there is a claim that there is a real entity in some fashion. And as such, I think it's only appropriate that we admit our biases up front and we state what our positions on Bigfoot actually are.
Yes, I'll agree there.
Yeah. So that puts me in a little bit of a complex position because when I think about it, I'm arguably coming from the position of being someone who, as of 2022, doesn't believe in Bigfoot as a real creature. And I will say, after researching the claimed evidence associated with most Bigfoot sightings for this episode, I'm much stronger in that position now. I really don't think that Bigfoot is a real creature. However, I will say that in my teenage years, I used to be a sort of believer. I will note this was less a case of me having an obsessive belief in Bigfoot and more a case of I just was a big fan of cryptids as a teenager. So my thoughts on Bigfoot were just part of a wider belief. However, over time, I have become more acquainted with the scientific method, with what standards of evidence are, and just generally the implausibility of an animal that big being able to live, reproduce, and move around a large swath of North America and escape capture for more than half a century now in terms of concerted efforts in that regard. However, to put a pin on all that, I will say that whilst I don't believe in Bigfoot at all anymore, I do still think it would be really cool if it turned out to exist.
Yes, that's very similar to my position on the matter. Again, I'm also have quite a scientific background, and even looking into, as part of my research for part 2, looking into the more scientific efforts to identify Bigfoot and prove his existence. I'm afraid none of it has convinced me, but again, I'm not one for believing in things without evidence, but I've always wanted the world to prove me wrong.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I think it's probably also appropriate that we mention our backgrounds. You are currently a professional scientific researcher, and I'm a former scientific and medical researcher. So we are obviously, due to our training, probably going to lean on the more skeptical side of this debate. But we have attempted to give the arguments of some prominent Bigfoot advocates a fair shake in the course of researching this episode. Okay, so we're just about ready to get started, Crofty, but before we do so, I would just like to take a quick minute to thank this episode's sponsor. So today's episode is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes to explore. Whether you're learning a new skill, finding your own unique style, or if you're ready to turn a hobby into a full-time career, Skillshare can give you the tools you need to succeed, with classes available at every skill level. From understanding your own creativity to developing the practical skills in art, design, writing, or music needed to realize your vision, or even to productivity techniques that keep you moving forward, Skillshare's huge variety of topics can help every step of your journey. You might recall in a previous episode that Crofty was getting help finding his own style in his music and art projects. He's now looking into taking that work further with more help from Andy J. Pizza in his class, Make Creativity Your Career, 6 Exercises to Create a Successful Side Project. Here Andy focuses on the practical side of a creative career, setting out your goals, marketing and promotion, and analysing your work to keep your career path going in the direction you want. As a prolific artist himself, Andy is well placed to show you how to turn your side projects into a career. Skillshare also provides an uninterrupted learning experience, meaning no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes, so there's always another direction to take your creative journey. With short video lessons designed to fit any schedule, projects to keep you focused and engaged, and a large community of fellow creatives around the world, you'll always be able to find the encouragement and inspiration you need to bring your creative vision to life. And if that wasn't enough, the first 1,000 subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. So, I think now that is the moment for us to move to our sources. Crofty, I think I went what people colloquially call hog wild in terms of references and sources for this particular episode. I've got a bunch of stuff here, so the way we split up this episode is that I'm going to be covering claims by Bigfoot advocates of possible Sasquatch or Bigfoot related beliefs held amongst Native American mythologies, as well as some of the earliest claimed encounters with a Sasquatch, running through the late 16th century through till the end of the 19th century. And then Crofty, you're going to kind of take over and take us up to the popularization of the term Bigfoot.
Yes, which we'll mostly cover between about 1920 and about 1960.
And then for the second part of this episode, we're going to be looking at claims of further Bigfoot encounters from the 1960s onwards, which includes by far the most famous alleged encounter with a female Sasquatch. My sources for today's episode include the work Framing the Anomalous, Stoneclad, Sequoia, and Cherokee Ethnoliteracy by Margaret Bender, which is in the book New Perspectives on Native North America, Cultures, Histories, and Representations. I used part 2 of the book Man-Like Monsters on Trial, which is a collection of Bigfoot-related articles edited by the anthropologist Dr. Marjorie M. Halpin. To the best of my knowledge, this book came from a conference that was designed to bring together prominent Bigfoot researchers and advocates with anthropologists. So there is a fair amount of pro-Bigfoot arguments in this particular work. So I have tried to stick on the side of what I thought were the more objective facts that were backed up by references. I also used John W. Burns' 1929 article introducing BC's hairy giants in Maclean's magazine, Wayne Suttle's articles on the cultural track of the Sasquatch from 1972, and some questions about the Sasquatch from 1976. I used some information from Chapter 2 of Abominable Science, Origins of the Yeti, Nessie and Other Famous Cryptids by Daniel Loxton and Donald R. Profero. For a critical eye on the major pieces of evidence that have been proposed by Bigfoot advocates for the creature's existence, I also used large sections of Bigfoot Exposed. An anthropologist examines America's enduring legend by Dr. David Day Daegling. And I did use some sections of chapters 3 and 4 of Bigfoot, The Life and Times of a Legend by Joshua Blue Burrs. I just want to say in advance, this work kind of advances a central argument that Bigfoot is an enduring entity within popular culture because he reflects the aspirations of the working class, which is a bizarre stance to me. I really don't get how you can get that from a creature by all means has endured because he's been adopted by a symbolism of the wild and like a defender of the environment in many ways. This work was criticised a lot also for ridiculing some of the central evidence presented for Bigfoot's existence. My experience from reading it was it's more a case that a lot of the facts around this claimed evidence are just on their face unkind to the Bigfoot advocate's position, rather than the author just being particularly malicious. But that's just my take on the matter.
A lot of what I'll be discussing will be the accounts of Bigfoot encounters in the 20th century. So I used books which had first-hand accounts, including Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us by John Green, which contained the first-hand account of Albert Ostman. I used Peter Burns' The Search for Bigfoot, which contained the account of Mukalat Harry, and the website BigfootEncounters.com, which reprinted the book written by the son of Fred Beck, who was one of the major names at Ape Canyon, which I'll be discussing later.
Yeah, I just want to quickly chime in here and say I also used that website. It is an explicitly pro the idea of Bigfoot existing website, but it also includes a lot of the classical accounts of early Sasquatch encounters, and I was able to verify 90% of them against the actual sources, so I'm relatively confident it is an honest website.
Yeah, it has its biases in terms of interpretation, but in terms of the information there is all as reliable as it can be with the subject matter. As well as those, I also used Chapter 2 of Loxton and Prothero's Abominable Science, and I also got some information from Sasquatch Legend Meets Science by Jeff Meldrum, who is one of the biggest names in Bigfoot research and one of the biggest pro-Bigfoot advocates out there. As well as that, I got accounts from various newspapers, including the Oregonian newspaper, the Humboldt Standard of Northern California, the Lewis County Tribune of Washington State, and the Province of British Columbia.
I have a few paper references myself that I'll throw in as I go, because mine gets a little complicated. So I also, Crofty, want to follow up from what you said there by saying I also read Sasquatch Legend Meets Science by Jeff Meldrum. In addition, I also read a couple of works by Grover S. Krantz, who was, much like Jeff Meldrum, was a professional anthropologist who also was an advocate for the existence of Bigfoot. And I basically selected these two works because they are both composed by men who have serious academic credentials. So I thought that was the fairest way of exposing myself to that side of the ideas. So I'd like to say after reading through these works, I tried to give them a fair shake. They did contain some useful information as to the details of like the major events and pieces of evidence given in favour of Bigfoot's existence. Ultimately, though, I, like Crofty, came away unconvinced by their arguments. In particular, both men seem to put a lot of stock in the authenticity of at least some of the various footprints that have been found and attributed to Bigfoot. In particular, Krantz has made the claim that it would require many thousands of hoaxers to be working full-time to account for the amount of footprints that have been found. But as David Daegling has noted, the actual amount of tracks that he claimed in his works that are out there are actually far, far, far less in number than he speculates are out there. That's kind of sleight of hand for me is enough to kind of kill that argument, but I also think a lot of Bigfoot advocates put a lot of weight on the authenticity of these footprints when, at the end of the day, we don't have a living example of a Sasquatch to compare them to. We have no idea what the actual standard is because we don't have any physical remains of the creature. In the case of Grover Krantz, I also felt that at times he had a bad habit of glossing over just how dubious some of the people associated with the major footprint finds were. This included people like Ray Wallace, who Crofty I'm sure you'll get into, and his activities at the Bluff Creek footprint scene, or how he glosses over things like how Roger Pattinson of the famous Patterson-Gimlin film is reported to have known how to make convincing Bigfoot prints with his bare hands. And we'll get into that when we end up discussing that particular piece of evidence in part 2. I found Jeff Meldrum also similarly relied a lot on the prints found by Paul Freeman, who is a man who is suspected by even most Bigfoot advocates, so people like the aforementioned John Green, Rene Darhendon, I think his name is, and others, to actually have been a hoaxer. And this is because he had an incredible ability just to constantly find Bigfoot tracks that other Bigfoot advocates then felt to be of a dubious nature. Both Meldrum and Krantz also placed a huge amount of stock in the Bossberg prints that we will discuss in part 2, which, to my mind, have been heavily contaminated by the activities of pretty much confirmed Bigfoot hoaxer Ivan Marks. And Krantz also kind of ignored this when he wrote at length about plaster casts of various Sasquatch handprints that were sent to him by Marks. So, not to go on too much longer, but a lot of the time their arguments to me seem to come down to this is too convincing or elaborate to be the work of a hoaxer, which I personally think underestimates just how ingenious the lengths to which many hoaxers are willing to go. And then finally, these authors just occasionally make claims that are just completely ridiculous. So, for example, to explain away the fact that no physical remains of Bigfoot have been found, Grover Krantz once claimed that we should expect to find Bigfoot remains at roughly the same rate as we find the remains of dead bears, which according to him is almost never. But as Daniel Loxton and Donald Profero note in Abominable Science, this is just a completely untrue claim. And indeed, we actually have multiple personal accounts coming both from the authors of that book and from a number of different Bigfoot skeptics and advocates of all having come across dead bear remains in the field. I won't go on any further because if we want to do a proper breakdown of these works, we could be here for a couple of hours and it would get in the way of everything else. Instead, I'd just like to point anyone who is more interested in the problems I found in these works to look to the review of David Daegling in the American Journal of Biological Anthropology and the extensive review of Jeff Meldrum's book found in the Skeptical Inquirer titled The Nonsense and Non-Science of Sasquatch, where multiple skeptics address problems they felt the work had. So moving forward, however, I just would like to quickly note we will be discussing the claims of some of these researchers again where they do relate to specific cases, so they will pop up again.
Yeah, and I will give Jeff Meldrum credit where it's due in that he does at least describe all of the claims of hoaxes. He doesn't skip any claims that Wallace's footprints, for example, were hoaxes. Just he doesn't really seem to hold any claims that they were real footprints to as high a standard.
But by all accounts I've heard, Jeff Meldrum is a nice guy and he is well-meaning. It's just I have serious disagreements with him on this. Speaking of which, I should probably just mention something quickly that I completely forgot to do, and I promised, so I need to do. I want to give a big thanks to the YouTuber Trey the Explainer for helping me out, getting me on started trying to find some sources for Native American stories that have been linked to the Sasquatch. I believe Trey has something in the works to do with Bigfoot himself at some point in the future, so keep an eye on his channel. And yeah, again, just a big thanks to Trey for just pointing out some of the sources. I think Trey has actually had some personal run-ins with some of the major Bigfoot advocates out there as well, from some of the communications I had with him. So I'm sure it's going to be an interesting thing to watch when he gets around to it. Okay, enough preamble. Let's get going then, Crofty. So, the earliest claimed evidence of beings that resemble the Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, comes to us from a wide body of Native American mythologies. Now, I want to say in advance, these accounts and creatures do vary wildly between both the stories of different Native American peoples and often within the stories given by the same peoples and within a single mythology. However, I was able to find a dozen or so different creatures in the course of my research that appear to have been related back to Bigfoot in some fashion. However, what became clear fairly quickly on examining these figures is that few to none of them seem to share the major attributes of what we would know as the modern Bigfoot. And even on a cursory examination, it's clear that many of these different creatures that have been claimed to be linked to Bigfoot within these tales often only have a slight resemblance. And at times that resemblance is literally as simple as these figures are also described as giants. What also doesn't help matters is that I've also seen something of a sleight of hand going on occasionally when Bigfoot advocates have discussed Native American mythologies, where rather than giving the specific name of the creature, they simply replace it with the name Bigfoot. And in my opinion, that kind of runs the risk of making these tales seem like a more cohesive body than they are in a pretty artificial fashion. As a result, I will try to refer to these figures here under their Native American names where I have them, which means I also have to apologize in advance for my inevitable mispronunciations. I've struggled to find pronunciations for these. I also want to stress that the myths I'm going to discuss here are nowhere near an exhaustive list, and I had to summarize a lot of stories very heavily and leave others out. Otherwise, again, we'd be here for hours, or at least hours longer than we will be. So beginning our discussion of potential Sasquatch-like creatures within Native American mythology, I think it would be best if we first explain exactly where the word Sasquatch originally came from. So according to the claims of Bigfoot researcher John Green, the term Sasquatch may have been first widely popularized by a man by the name of John W. Burns, who was a teacher and an Indian agent on the Chehalis Native American reservation, which coincidentally, and this will come back quite a bit later, is situated near the town of Harrison Hot Springs, which is east of Vancouver in British Columbia. So according to the work Bigfoot, The Life and Times of a Legend, Burns had first heard stories of wild men living in this region from the anthropologist Charles Hill Trout. And in 1929, he compiled a number of these accounts for an article in the magazine Maclean's, which I discussed before, was titled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants. In this article, he named the wild man as a Sasquatch, which according to the anthropologist Dr. Wayne Suttles, was most likely an Anglicization of a word from the Halkomelem language of the coastal Salish people. He also suggested a couple of alternative pronunciations of the original word, so that included Saskets and Sasketch. So you can see where you could get Sasquatch from that. So, to get us going, I'm going to read through one of the stories that Burns included in this article, and that he claimed was related to him by a Chehalis man by the name of Peter Williams. So here is what he titles Peter's encounter with the giant. One evening in the month of May 20 years ago, I was walking along the foot of the mountain about a mile from the Chehalis Reserve. I thought I heard a noise, something like a grunt, nearby. Looking in the direction in which it came, I was startled to see what I took at first sight to be a huge bear crouched on a boulder 20 or 30 feet away. I raised my rifle to shoot it, but as I did, the creature stood up and let out a piercing yell. It was a man, a giant, no less than 6½ feet in height and covered in hair. He was in a rage and jumped from the boulder to the ground. I fled, but not before I felt his breath upon my cheek. I never ran so fast before or since, through brush and undergrowth towards the Statlu, or Chehalis River, where my dugout was moored. From time to time I looked back over my shoulder. The giant was fast overtaking me. 100 feet separated us. Another look and the distance measured less than 50. Then the Chehalis, and in a moment the dugout shot across the stream to the opposite bank. The swift river, however, did not in the least daunt the giant, for he began to wade in immediately. I arrived home almost worn out from running, and I felt sick. Taking an anxious look around the house, I was relieved to find the wife and children inside. I bolted the door and barricaded it with everything in hand. Then, with my rifle ready, I stood near the door and awaited his coming. At this point, according to Burns, Peter then added that if he had not been so much excited, he could easily have shot the giant when he began to wade across the river. So, after an anxious waiting of 20 minutes, Peter heard a noise approaching like the trampling of a horse and looked through a crack in the window. He saw that the giant was there, and as darkness had not yet set in, he got a good look at him. Except that he was covered with hair and twice the bulk of the average man, there was nothing to distinguish him from the rest of us. He pushed against the wall of the old house with such force that it shook back and forth. The old cedar shook, and timbers creaked and groaned so much under the strain that I was afraid it would fall down and kill us. I whispered to the old woman to take the children under the bed. After prowling and grunting like an animal around the house, he went away. We were glad for the children and wife were uncomfortable under the old bedstead. Next morning I found his tracks in the mud around the house, the biggest of either man or beast I've ever seen. The tracks measured 22 inches in length, but narrow in proportion to their length. So Crofty, for anyone familiar with kind of more modern stories and accounts involving Bigfoot, that does sound pretty familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So you can quite clearly see why this would then be related to the later figure of Bigfoot. However, if you read through some of the later stories in this article, you do see something of an extra dimension to this figure that starts to get a little bit more away from the more modern concept of what Bigfoot is. Okay, so this story comes from a man by the name of Charlie Victor from the Squaw Reserve near Chilliwack. I'm pretty certain I got most of that wrong. I apologise in advance. And this was a story of how he, in fact, shot one of these creatures, specifically a juvenile male. I was hunting in the mountains near Ilatchik. I had my dog with me. I came out on a plateau where there were several big cedar trees. The dog stood before one of the trees and began to growl and bark at it. On looking up to see what excited him, I noticed a large hole in the tree 7 feet from the ground. The dog pawed and leapt upon the trunk, and looked at me to raise him up, which I did, and he went into the hole. The next moment a muffled cry came from the hole. I said to myself, the dog is tearing into a hare, and with my rifle ready I urged the dog to drive him out, and out came something I took for a bear. I shot and it fell with a thud to the ground. Murder, oh my, I spoke to myself in surprise and alarm, and that's a very early 20th century way of reacting to something like that. Oh my.
Oh my.
Good heavens. Murder, oh my, I spoke to myself in surprise and alarm, for the thing I had shot looked to me like a white boy. He was rude. He was about 12 or 14 years of age. According to Burns at this point, in his further description of the boy, Charlie said that his hair was black and woolly. So wounded and bleeding, the poor fellow sprayed upon the ground, but when I drew close to examine the extent of his injury, he let out a wild yell, or rather a call as if he were appealing for help. From across the mountain a long way off rolled a booming voice. Nearer and more near came the voice, and every now and again the boy would return an answer, as if directing the owner of the voice. Less than a half hour out from the depths of the forest came the strangest and wildest creature one could possibly see. I raised my rifle, not to shoot, but in case I would have to defend myself. The hairy creature, for that was what it was, walked towards me without the slightest fear. The wild person was a woman. Her face was almost, and here he uses a very offensive term for a black person, so his face was that black, and her long straight hair fell to her waist. In height she would be about 6 feet, but her chest and shoulders were well above the average breadth. Charlie remarked that he had met several wild people in his time, but had never seen anyone half so savage in appearance as this woman. The old brave confessed he was really afraid of her. She cast a hasty glance... I'm skipping forward here a little. She cast a hasty glance at the boy. Her face took on a demoniacal expression when she saw he was bleeding. She turned upon me savagely, and in the Douglas tongue said, "You have shot my friend." I explained in the same language, for I'm part Douglas myself, that I had mistaken the boy for a bear and that I was sorry. She did not reply, but began a sort of wild frisk or dance around the boy, chanting in a loud voice for a minute or two, and as if to answer her, from the distant woods came the same sort of chanting troll. In her hand she carried something like a snake, about 6 feet in length, but thinking over the matter since, I believe it was the intestine of some animal. But whatever it was, she constantly struck the ground with it. She picked up the boy with one hairy hand, with as much ease as if he had been a wax doll. There was a challenge of defiance in her black eyes and dark looks, as she faced and spoke to me a second time, and the dreadful words she used set me shaking. "Siwash, you'll never kill another bear." So according to Burns, the old hunter's eyes moistened when he then admitted he had not shot a bear or anything else since that fatal day. From this story, and as we'll get into when I talk about some more stories that were collected from around the Pacific Northwest region, the giants that are referred to as Sasquatch are most commonly characterized as a giant wild variety of people, rather than as some sort of creature or beast. Indeed, in other stories that I'm going to discuss shortly, we have examples of them being capable of making fire, of speaking Native American languages, and in some they're indeed occasionally shown to possess clothing and to live in villages. And all of that is quite different from our concept of what Bigfoot is. We very much have a modern image of Bigfoot as this sort of primate-like figure. Moreover, the hairiness that is described in these stories is somewhat variable. So sometimes the Sasquatch or related figures is described as being covered in hair all over their body, or they are simply described as having long hair coming from their head. Indeed, it was this image of the Sasquatch as a giant, long-haired group of secretive Native Americans that Burns himself would subscribe to in later life, and which he evidently thought was a real living creature. And to the best of my knowledge, he would continue to popularize these figures in the decades ahead, both from articles in newspapers, I think including the Washington Post. I did try and look for some of the papers that his articles were in, but I either had the trouble of their archives were not online, or they wanted, something in the effect of $60 to view one article, which, no, quite frankly.
Bit steep.
Yeah. I did pay some money to get some of these papers, though. But the final thing for me to note about Burns is that he will re-emerge later on, I believe, during part of Crofty's account.
Yeah, he does briefly pop up, yes.
So moving on from Burns, probably the most notable attempt to gather Native American myths from the Pacific Northwest that could potentially be linked to Bigfoot was conducted by the anthropologist Wayne Suttles, who I mentioned before, most notably in his 1972 article on the cultural track of the Sasquatch. Now, Suttles is very open throughout the article that he does somewhat entertain the possibility that the Sasquatch exists, and I do have a number of disagreements with some of the arguments he makes as to its potential existence, but for the moment, I would like to focus on the discussion of the creatures and stories that he collected, mostly from the coastal Salish people, which do constitute a very valuable resource. According to this article, among the Upper Stallo people, the Sasquatch is described as being an 8-foot-tall man covered in dark fur who leaves footprints about 20 inches long. The touch of a Sasquatch could render people unconscious, and these beings stole women to keep as wives, with whom they often had half-human children. He also notes that they would occasionally steal food from people, but that was simply to feed their families. They also apparently had their own language, which these stolen wives were apparently able to learn, but that they would forget if they succeeded in escaping and re-entering human society. I haven't written this down, but I believe in Suttle's account he notes that many of these women were seen to have started to grow hair all over their bodies during their time with the Sasquatch. So at the time that these stories were collected, most notably by anthropologist Wilson Duff, these creatures were said to have recently been encountered on moonlit nights, and anyone who ran from them generally found themselves followed, but did manage to escape. In another of these accounts, a man is said to have shot at a Sasquatch, whilst in yet another, a Sasquatch is said to have approached and broken into a house in order to steal dried fish. Now, I want to make a note that in his article, Suttles explicitly links this account with a later Bigfoot encounter that was recorded by Renee Dahinden and John Green, and it comes from a First Nations woman named Jeannie Chapman, who was from Ruby Creek, which again is in the immediate vicinity of Harrison Hot Springs. And according to her account, in 1941, a giant creature walking on two legs approached her house and entered her storage lean-to, at which point she and her family fled. I just want to mention this briefly here because unfortunately neither Crofty nor myself came across this account until about an hour before we were supposed to record this podcast. So neither of us have had a chance to go into it into detail and examine the circumstances around it. The one thing I will say is I believe this account came out after another event that did generate a lot of publicity for the Sasquatch in 1957. This general archetype of a nocturnal giant is repeated amongst many of the other groups that make up the coastal Salish, though there are quite a few variations on its exact features. So among the lower Stalo people, the Sasquatch is known as part of two separate creatures that are known as the Timber Giants, which also includes an entity known as the Siyea, which was marked by its great strength by always carrying a small stick with which it could topple trees. In other versions reported by the same people, there are actually 4 separate types of timber giant, though the other 2 are said to be similar to the Sasquatch, and I couldn't find much more information on them. In addition, it was said that each of these creatures was able to just disappear suddenly, and this is a common feature amongst some of the other creatures reported by the Salish. Amongst the Musqueam people, it is held that the Sasquatch is a male version of another common figure found amongst the coastal Salish, who is known under a variety of names, but is generally referred to by anthropologists as the Cannibal Ogress, which is a pretty metal name.
A new band name, I think.
Yeah. Elsewhere amongst the coastal Salish, this people, I've been saying Salish, it's probably Salish, this figure is generally held to be a distinct entity from that of the Sasquatch. And she's generally described as a large, or sometimes a fat woman, who stole children, who put them in a basket, which she carried on her back, and then took them off and roasted and ate them. And from what I can remember, there is a fairly common motif of the tail being turned on the Cannibal Ogress and her being roasted in her own fire, which makes me think very much of some of the tales surrounding the Russian folkloric figure of Baba Yaga.
I was just thinking that.
Who often had the tables turned on her and ended up being forced into her own oven. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this figure anymore here today, but it's things like this, Crofty, that make me think, we do need to do some more episodes that focus more heavily on specific Native American mythologies, if we can.
Agreed.
Before we move on from her, I also just want to quickly mention, this figure was occasionally also thought not just to have been some form of non-human creature, but occasionally it is also mentioned to have been a human woman who had gone wild. So in the case of the Lumi people, these figures are known as the Kamikwes, which again is probably wrong, I apologise, and are described as 7-foot tall creatures that were shaggy like a bear, but that in form resembled a big monkey. I think the exact words was like a big monkey. Elsewhere, they also describe wild Indians who wore no clothes, but were said to possess guns, who could throw a poison that could paralyze a man, and that would catch beavers and sell the skins to white people. Amongst the Saanich peoples, we also see figures referred to as the Zamiquas, who were also described as tall, wild Indians, who look like people, but whose legs cannot bend. However, they are still capable of hopping along very quickly. The Saanich man Louis Pelkey also reported an encounter his uncle had with a figure known as the Tree Striker, which he described quite simply as a man walking with a cane late on a moonlit night, and attempted to bring down a tree on his uncle and his wife's canoe. And one small detail that Suttles includes is that the falling of the tree is said to signify to the victim that someone in their immediate family is going to die. The Klalam peoples report the presence of a similar set of stiff-legged giants known as the Seedkwu, along with wild people who talk like birds and can make people sleep before they steal their fish. The people of the Puget Sound area similarly report 3 different types of wild creatures, which include the Stital, who, going by their descriptions, Wayne Suttles thought may simply have been another Native American group who simply spoke a language that they didn't understand. These figures are also said to have been quite malevolent and tricksterish, so they were said to possess a whistle that could paralyze someone, and apparently they liked to perform tricks such as the old classic of stripping a man naked and tying his legs apart.
So they were popular on stag nights.
Yeah, very popular on most university campuses, I imagine, as well. They were also said to live by hunting and fishing, and would sometimes steal children or adolescents in order to keep as wives or even as slaves. They similarly report another group of giants living underground in houses, known as the Glosabg, along with the aforementioned group of the Seedquu, which the Klallam peoples reported. The Twana people of the Hood Canal similarly reported entities known as the Siatquu, who were known in English as Forest Indians, who were said to be of human form but taller than most normal people, and to be naked except for a breech clout, to have no odour, which allowed them to sneak up on unsuspecting prey, and even to be invisible. The Twana also report other creatures, such as underwater people who lived in houses at the bottom of Hood Canal, along with creatures referred to as earth dwarves, and a curious figure known as the Wet Cedar Tree Ogre, which, according to Suttles, was a being of uncertain form, and that was said to be able to put hunters to sleep and to steal their souls. Then finally, we have my favourite description of what Suttles termed the Sasquatch-like creatures, which comes to us from the Quinault River people. And it's quite a short description, so I'm just going to quickly read it out. In the mountains live many giants called Tsalo, or Tsajto. I'm mutilating that, I apologise, who look almost the same as humans. On their right big toe, a long quartz spike grows up to 6 feet long. If a human is kicked with this, he will likely die. Bit of an understatement there.
You think?
And I want to just quickly mention this, Crofty, because I think with this entity, we have found the biggest of the Bigfoots.
Does a spike count as part of the foot, though?
Yeah, it's attached to the foot. So, like, is the nail on your big toe part of your foot?
Fair point. So yeah, a 6-foot spike plus a 16-inch foot, that's a 7-foot foot.
Yeah, so congratulations to the Quinault River people. You officially win biggest Bigfoot. So these creatures are said to be great thieves. People avoid the creeks on which they live. Some still come around the village at night and borrow a harpoon or a drift net, but usually return it before morning. They are fond of playing tricks on humans, such as sneaking up and kicking them. Classic. Tying them to trees with thongs lashed to the genitals, which you're getting into some stranger territory there. And some of them even are said to have married humans. And even today, there are people living who claim them as ancestors. So these giants were often heard at night, and they're explicitly described as making whistling sounds. Okay, so Crofty, what do you make of all those different accounts? How do those compare to claims that they resemble Bigfoot in some fashion?
Well, until we got to the 6-foot spike, these still seemed quite human, if just unusually large and hairy. Some of the accounts seemed very early 20th century, like some of the stuff we saw, some of the stuff we discussed in Vampires, that more about othering and other people rather than describing an actual monster.
Yeah, that can be a problem with some of the early anthropology. Is a lot of it is reported in the vein of look at these superstitious people. There is a little bit of a resemblance between these figures. I think Wayne Suttles narrowed this down to just a couple of criteria that most of these Sasquatch-like creatures have in common, and they are that they are giants, and they often live in either the woods or the mountains. Those are the main characteristics, as far as I can tell, and I agree with him, that these creatures have in common. Thing is, not all those creatures I described are even described as hairy.
Yeah.
The lower and upper Stallo people and the Lumi describe them as hairy. None of the other accounts describe those giants as hairy.
And also, giant is quite relative. think at one point you mentioned one that was 6.5 feet tall.
Yeah, I mean, that was very tall by the standards of the early 20th century.
Yeah, it's tall by the standards of the time, but we know it's well within possibility for humans.
To me, I don't think there's enough here to definitively say this is Bigfoot, like a real living primate-like being that existed and had a place in Native American folklore and mythology.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
So, moving beyond the Native American mythologies and folklore of the Pacific Northwest, quite a lot of books written on Bigfoot also attempt to draw comparisons to figures in mythologies found throughout the eastern United States. This is something of a curious comparison to make to my mind, given that most of the key encounters been argued to be strong evidence of the creature's existence by Bigfoot advocates have taken place largely in the Pacific Northwest region, or in British Columbia. The obvious reply that a Bigfoot advocate then could give is that Bigfoot sightings have been reported all over North America, which is true, but that then, of course, invites the question of how is a large pan-continental creature managing to breed and live and travel and go undetected when we've detected every other large major mammal that's distributed over wide parts of North America. However, for the sake of argument, I will indulge in these claims and examine a couple of figures found in indigenous folklore throughout the eastern and northern United States and Canada. So the first figure that has drawn comparisons to Bigfoot is one that you probably have heard of, Crofty, and I think a lot of people probably will have heard of. And this is the creature known as the Witico, better known under its more familiar anglicised name of the Wendigo.
Ah, yes.
So, a lot of modern depictions of the Wendigo have this as a giant, heavily furred creature, often with antlers or horns of some fashion. As best I can tell, this is an entirely later development and is not found in the Native American sources that I looked at. So this figure is largely found within the mythologies of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Great Lakes region in the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. And this includes the tribes of the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Naskapi, and the Innu, amongst others. According to one report by a Father Gwynard of beliefs amongst the Atikamequa people, the Wikito are solitary, man-like cannibals that are naked but impervious to the cold, and that are marked by their black skin, which is covered in sand glued to them by resin. These creatures have long teeth, claws like a wild beast, feet that are more than 2 feet long, one of which is said to be missing a big toe. They're also said to have no lips, and also to have large, bloodshot eyes that resemble those of an owl. This creature was further said to be invulnerable and extraordinarily strong, and to be able both to swim and to fly. Moreover, it is said that the Wikito is a nocturnal hunter of men, and that it also possesses foreknowledge of their chosen victim's location. So amongst the Ojibwe and the Cree, these figures are also described as malformed giants, though I then did also find an account by a Cree minister by the name of Edward Ahenakew, which he claimed to have received from a Cree medicine man named Wapust, who denied that these creatures were giants at all and claimed this was a misinterpretation by white writers. Later, there was also something of a tendency amongst anthropologists to associate the belief in the Wikito with a very real form of psychosis. This supposed Wikito psychosis had 2 stages, the first being characterized by melancholy and inertia, along with a desire to consume other humans, but a fear of doing so. The second stage then sees a progression to violence and ultimately cannibalism. This claimed form of psychosis has stuck around for quite a long time, according to the sources I consulted. However, later 20th century studies have noted that few to no examples of claimed Wikito psychosis have actually involved reliable first-hand reports of cannibalism occurring. So, for example, Lou Marano's study Wendigo Psychosis, The Anatomy of an Emic-Etic Confusion from 1985, found that of some 70 different claimed accounts of such psychosis, a grand total of 0 had first-hand confirmations of cannibalism actually occurring. So, It is possible to see some vague resemblance between this creature and the modern ideas of Bigfoot, specifically in the creature also having large feet, although its violent nature does stand somewhat at odds with later encounters with Bigfoot. And what also kind of scuppers any connection is that in the accounts I found, this figure is said not to be a form of wild beast or a devilish or a demonic entity, but instead to have been a former human who resorted to cannibalism, or simply a human who had been possessed by an evil spirit that came to him in a dream. Moving along, another creature that's often connected with Bigfoot comes to us from Cherokee mythology, and that is the Stoneclad or the Stonecoat. So this is effectively a family of different figures, and is also found amongst other Native American mythologies. So the major accounts in which this figure appears were collected around the turn of the century by James Mooney, who was at the time in the employ of the Bureau of American Ethnology. So according to him, the Stoneclad is primarily marked by its huge stature, its taste for human flesh, having a heart made of either ice or quartz, and of course its skin being covered in stone. There are some variants where the skin is not actually covered in stone, but it is shown by other means to be impregnable. I'd like to present a paraphrased example of a myth that involves this creature that James Mooney claims to have collected from a Cherokee medicine man by the name of Swimmer, roughly around 1888. This man in turn claimed this story was told to him by the old men of his settlement whilst he was a boy, and in it the Stoneclad is referred to as a Nunyunu-wi. So on one day, when the people of the settlement were out in the mountains on a great hunt, one man who had gone ahead of the rest of his people climbed a ridge, and he found a large river on the other side. There he saw an old man walking along the opposite ridge, with a cane that was made of bright shining rock. Every now and again, the man would point his cane in a certain direction, then sniff it. Eventually he pointed it towards the hunter's village, then smelled it several times as if the smell was very good, then started towards it. Along the way he crossed the river by throwing out his cane, which suddenly turned into a great bridge, then promptly turned back into a cane after he crossed. On seeing this, the hunter fled back to his village, where he told his story to the local medicine man. The medicine man said this creature was a wicked cannibal called Nunyunu-wi, or dressed in stone, and that it was very hard to escape or defeat him due to his guiding stick and his skin covered in solid rock. However, the medicine man did know of one weakness, and that was that the old man could not stand to look upon a menstruating woman, and indeed that seeing 7 such women would kill him. So the men go amongst the village and gather 7 menstruating women, who each strip and stand along the path that the old man is coming down. Upon meeting the first woman, he cries out, "You, my grandchild, you are in a very bad state." After rushing past her, he met the second woman and cried out, "You, my child, you are in a terrible way." As he continued on and met the other women, his stride began to slow, and eventually he began to vomit blood before he eventually collapses on the trail. There, the medicine man drove 7 sourwood stakes into his body in order to pin him down, and when night came, the men heaped a great number of logs over him and set fire to them. As the people of the village gathered around the old man, he started to talk and told them of medicine for many types of sickness. At midnight, he began to sing hunting songs until at last daybreak came and the heap was reduced to ashes. The medicine man then bid them to rake aside the ashes, and where the old man had been, they found a magical stone and a lump of red clay. The medicine man kept the stone for himself and painted the faces of his people with clay, and whatever each person wished for whilst the painting was done, be it success at hunting, at working a skill, or simply to lead a long life, that was granted. So this story includes an interesting aspect that's found quite commonly throughout Algonquian mythologies, which is, whilst this creature is seen to be in some ways dangerous or malevolent, if he is treated or dealt with in the correct fashion, he can be of benefit to the people who encounter him. So, by knowing how to defeat him, so to speak, he divulges his secret and gives physical rewards to these people. In his collection, Mooney also includes a story of a hag-like creature, or an ogress, known as the Utlunta, or Spearfinger, which he implies to be either the wife or simply the female form of the Stoneclad. Now, this figure is marked out from the male Stoneclad by having a long, spear-like finger, which he uses to menace Cherokee communities by ripping out and consuming the livers of children. This creature is also marked by having her heart placed where her spear finger and her palm meet, and indeed she is killed by having this spot struck by a Cherokee arrow after her skin proved impervious. Similar stone giants also appear amongst the stories of the Iroquois, under the name of the Hustradu. In this mythology, these figures are created by the figure of Tawiscaron, who within wider Iroquois mythology is the antagonist of one of their major folk heroes by the name of Tarachiawagan. So specifically, these creatures were created by having pine turpentine smeared across their body, after which they rolled in beach sand over and over again to form their thick hides. These fearsome creatures are, however, defeated when Tarachiawagan creates a race of dwarves, also known as little people. That's not me being patronizing, that's what the text says, which succeed in removing the stone giant's armor. So reduced are these creatures' numbers that they then flee into the woods, where they go on to live a solitary life and are said to kill and eat strangers who enter their domain. So I was also able to find a couple of alternative origin stories for these figures. The first is that they were simply ordinary humans who wandered into the wilderness, became addicted to raw fish, and wallowed in sand until their bodies became giant and their skins so encrusted that they were impervious to arrows. The second is that they were the children of a race of raw, meat-eating giants who rubbed their offspring's skin with dry sand until it became so calloused that it took on the appearance of stone. To wrap up my section on Native American myths that have been in some way associated with the Sasquatch, I have a couple of similar figures that appear in the myths of the Huron Wyandots, under the name of the Strendu, or the Flinty Giants. Now in form, these figures are very similar to those found in the stories of the Iroquois, but with one slight differentiating factor. So, whilst these creatures are marked by their stone skin and their cannibalistic nature, they are also marked by their detachable finger, which, similar to the cane of the Nunyunui, is used to locate humans. However, these creatures are also marked out by being considered fairly naive and easy to trick, and as also being able to be tamed through human kindness and through the feeding of lard to sate their thirst for human meat. So, Crofty, I think it would be a bit of a stretch to relate some of those creatures to a large herbivorous primate.
Quite a stretch, yes, I'd say.
Or herbivorous, I should say, sorry.
Yeah.
Whilst figures such as the Stoneclad really do make for an interesting group to discuss, I think we can agree on the whole that the individuals found within Native American mythology bear only a slim resemblance on the whole to our idea of what Bigfoot comprises, and are mostly very disparate in the exact forms of their creatures.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, so moving on from Native American mythology, I'm now going to talk about a few accounts that come to us from early European explorers, which have been claimed in some way to be linked to Bigfoot. The earliest direct reports I supposedly have date back from the 16th and 17th centuries, and involve beings known as Los Vigilantes Oscuros, or the Dark Watchers. In more modern stories that I literally was only able to just find from searching around websites online, these are said to be giant black human silhouettes, often encountered at dawn or at dusk. According to these stories, these figures are best ignored, and apparently will leave anyone who minds their own business and sticks to the trail alone. I say that these are all claimed stories because I can't find any accounts that actually date back that far from the 16th or 17th century. Instead, what I found when I tried to look into this was just a lot of different websites repeating what are recognizably modern stories of just vague statements that Spanish and Mexican explorers and settlers had encountered stories of these beings during the initial exploration of coastal California. So at this point, I'd like to credit episode 522 of the Skeptoid podcast, which is also titled Dark Watchers, for giving me a small amount of extra information to go on. In the interest of full disclosure, I do want to say, though, that the writer of this podcast, Brian Dunning, was previously convicted of wire fraud against the company eBay, who I think he stole something in the region of $200,000 from, and served prison time for it. I completely understand if that makes him sound like a really dubious source. However, I was able to verify independently some of the information he claimed in the podcast itself, and generally my experience of trying to research the topic matched his experience. So according to that podcast, stories of the Dark Watchers pop up a lot online, but there are only really 3 pieces of information that are usually given to support them. The first is that these figures appear in John Steinbeck's 1938 short story Flight, which I have to point out is a work of fiction. The second is another appearance in Robertson Jeffers' 1937 poem Such Counsels You Gave to Me, which, again, work of fiction, although you can easily write off these accounts, but both those works were composed around the same time in roughly the same area, so there's a small chance they could have been inspired by some local stories at the time, but we don't have anything that dates before the 1930s. The third claim is a general claim that these figures exist amongst the mythology of the Native American Chumash people. I looked into this in more detail along the lines of what the Skeptoid podcast did. The Chumash people's myths have been recorded since the early 20th century, most notably by the ethnologist John Peabody Harrington, and were most authoritatively compiled by Dr. Thomas Blackburn in his 1976 book, December Child, A Book of Chumash Oral Narratives. Now, thanks to archive.org, I was able to borrow a copy of that book, and after a look through it, I agree with the podcast's conclusion that the only beings that can vaguely be compared to Bigfoot in those stories are entities known as the Nunashish. So in Chumash mythology, there are 3 worlds: the world we see, the world above, and the world below. It is the world below that is populated by the Nunashish, who are said to venture forth at night and travel around. These creatures include the Hap-Hap, which is said to be very devilish, and when he inhales, he draws in trees and rocks, which he then swallows. In addition to this, we have the figures of the Kuku and the Luwelu, who are said to be marked by their loose facial skin, and the quite disgusting point of their bodies being covered in pus. To this, we can also add the Yao-Yao, which is said to be similar to the previous 2 creatures, and the Zol-Zol, who are said to be big creatures that are covered in feathers. However, I feel confident in saying that none of these figures have very much resemblance at all to the modern image of Bigfoot or even to John W. Burns' version of the Sasquatch. It also should be noted that most of these creatures are explicitly described as having human-like forms, but you could potentially argue that for Bigfoot as well, so that might be something of a moot point. Similarly, the city of Natchez in Mississippi claims that in the 1720s, a Jesuit priest living amongst the local Natchez people reported an encounter with a strange creature that yelled in the night, that was large, strong and hairy, and that preyed on livestock. So I initially thought that this was one of those just tall tales that a town has adopted to differentiate itself. Turns out there is an actual account behind this. So this account comes from a 1977 book known as Chauwas, Louisiana, which again I was able to get a copy on loan thanks to archive.org. And this includes selections from historical works by a Jesuit priest and historian by the name of Pierre-François Xavier de Chauwa, who wrote extensively on the French colonies in North America during his travels there in the early 18th century. So the specific passage comes from page 136 and reads as follows. The first night I lay in this settlement, there happened a great alarm about 9 o'clock in the evening. Upon asking the reason of it, I was told there was, in the neighbourhood, a beast of any unknown species, of an extraordinary bulk, and whose cry did not in the least resemble that of any known animal. Nobody, however, could say that he had seen it, and they formed a judgment of its size entirely from its strength. It had already carried off some sheep and calves, and worried some cows. I told those that gave me this account that an enraged wolf might very well have done all of this, and that as to its cry, people were deceived in these matters every day. I could persuade nobody, they still would have it was some monstrous beast. It was heard again, and everyone ran out armed with what he could find, but it was to no purpose. That's the entire account. I couldn't find any follow-up later in the work. It should be said in its original form, this account sounds somewhat like our modern idea of what a Sasquatch is. It is significantly more violent than perhaps the more modern, eco-friendly idea of Bigfoot, and the Bigfoot that's seen in accounts in the mid-20th century onwards. However, what we really have when you break it down is a creature that yells in the night and preys on livestock. So there are claims that it's large, strong, and hairy, but no one present actually saw it, so we don't know the size of it. And the original recorder thought it was attributable to a more mundane explanation. I think that's a fair assessment, Crofty.
Yeah, I'd agree there.
To me, that does not sound particularly convincing.
No. Livestock kidnapping stories are heard all over the world and attributed to all kinds of monsters.
Yeah, looking forward to the Chupacabra when we do that one.
Didn't we mention that in Vamps?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, yeah. Our next account then dates from the 1840s, and it comes to us from the diary of Elkanah Walker, titled 9 Years with the Spokane Indians, which was published in 1976 by Clifford Drury. So Elkanah Walker was a pioneer missionary who settled in Oregon County in the mid-19th century, and who most notably attempted to bring Protestantism to the Spokane people of what is now eastern Washington state and northern Idaho. I want to put a small asterisk next to this account, and that's for the reason that I wasn't able to track down any copy of the original journal it appears in. There doesn't seem to be any version of this work that I can find online, and I could conceivably have bought a paper copy, but all the versions I found were well over $100 and would have taken quite a while to ship internationally as well. So I have foregone finding the first-hand copy in favour of a claimed version of the text from the website we mentioned before, bigfootencounters.com. So the only reason I did include this was that the same website did include accurate versions of other accounts that I am going to talk about later on. So here is the account in full. Bear with me if I trouble you with a little of their superstitions. They believe in a race of giants which inhabits a certain mountain off to the west of us. This mountain is covered with perpetual snow. They, meaning the creatures, inhabit the snow peaks. They hunt and do all their work at night. They are man-stealers. They come to people's lodges at night when the people are asleep and take them and put them under their skins and to their place of abode without even waking. Their track is 1.5 feet long. They steal salmon from Indian nets and eat them raw as bears do. If the people are awake, they always know when they are coming very near by their strong smell that is most intolerable. It is not uncommon for them to come in the night and give free whistles, and then the stones will begin to hit their houses. So there are a few attributes here that do resemble later reports of attributes associated with Bigfoot. I think I'm right in saying this might be the earliest account I've found that includes the attribute of a strong, nearly intolerable smell. I might have missed something, but I think that's the earliest one. These creatures are also marked again by big feet. Also, the throwing of stones somewhat does appear in claimed accounts of encounters with Bigfoot in more modern times. So I know Jeff Meldrum claims to have had an encounter where a stone was thrown onto a path that he was on that he could find no explanation for.
And there will be one major encounter with several stones being thrown in my section.
Yes. coming up shortly.
But no spoilers yet.
However, to be more skeptical, I think it's important to point out that this isn't a claimed sighting. This is a second-hand report, and I don't have much more details around the context with it. And rightly or wrongly, this belief is being reported purely as a superstition by its writer. Another minor note is that the location of Elkanah Walker's mission is said to have been roughly 25 miles northwest of the now city of Spokane, Washington, which gives us a number of candidates for the mountain mentioned in his account. The website I mentioned, however, goes to some lengths to associate this account with Mount St. Helens, which may be to try and tie it to a couple of other accounts, one of which I'm about to talk to, and I think, Crofty, you're also going to talk to about your own account that involves that location.
That's right.
So, to get the other account out of the way, this account comes from the Irish painter Paul Kane's journal of his western travels throughout the United States from 1846 to 1847. Specifically, this account is found in his later work, Wanderings of an Artist, thanks again to archive.org, where I managed to grab it from, and it is under his entry for March 26th, 1847. So, to quote, "When we arrived at the mouth of the Cattle-Pootel River, 26 miles from Fort Vancouver, I stopped to make a sketch of the volcano, Mount St. Helens, distant, I suppose about 30 or 40 miles. This mountain has never been visited by either whites or Indians. The latter assert that it is inhabited by a race of beings of a different species who are cannibals, and whom they hold in great dread. They also say that there is a lake at its base, with a very extraordinary kind of fish in it, with a head more resembling that of a bear than any other animal. These superstitions are taken from the statement of a man who they say went to the mountain with another, and escaped the fate of his companion, who was eaten by the skookums, or evil genii. I offered a considerable bribe to any Indian who would accompany me in its exploration, but could not find one hardy enough to venture." So that's the extent of his account. He doesn't follow up on it any further elsewhere. So this account is quite similar to that of Elkanah Walker's, so I'm not going to repeat the concerns we have with it, because they're very similar to with the previous account. I just wanted to note that Paul Kane actually did stop at Elkanah Walker's mission, as far as I'm aware. It also should probably be noted that Paul Kane didn't get this account from the Spokane peoples. It came from a different group, which may explain why there's more of a violent edge to it, with the creatures being described as cannibals. It's a little unclear from the wording of his journal, but as far as I can tell, he received this story from the Clackamas Native Americans, who dwelled along the Clackamas River in modern Oregon. So, moving on, one of the most famous early encounters with a Sasquatch dates from 1884, and it's also somewhat notable in that it might be the earliest account that was documented in some form by the press at the time. What's also notable in the eyes of many Bigfoot advocates is that this account is also the earliest to involve a potential Sasquatch being captured. So this incident, which took place outside the town of Yale, is usually referred to as the Jacko Affair, after the name given to the creature involved, and was first detailed in the July 4th edition of the paper The Daily Colonist. So I did manage to track down a copy of that article, which I'll read from shortly. However, according to cryptozoologist Lorene Coleman, in her 2003 book Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America, so you can probably tell what side of the debate she lands on, this incident didn't receive wider fame until it was rediscovered by a reporter by the name of Bruce McKelvey, who went on to share it with John Green and Renee Dahinden. It then received wider fame through its inclusion in the writer Ivan Sanderson's 1961 book Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, which in itself helped popularize early interest in Bigfoot. So the copy of the original newspaper article that I got, again, came from archive.org and reads as follows. In the immediate vicinity of Number 4 Tunnel, situated some 20 miles above this village, are bluffs of rock which have hitherto been unsurmountable, but on Monday morning last were successfully scaled by Mr. Onderdonk's employees on the regular train from Lytton. Assisted by Mr. Costeron, the British Columbia Express Company's messenger, and a number of gentlemen from Lytton and points east of that place who, after considerable trouble and perilous climbing, succeeded in capturing a creature which may truly be called half man and half beast. Jacko, as the creature has been called by his captors, is something of the gorilla type, standing 4 feet 7 inches in height and weighing 127 pounds. He has long, black, strong hair and resembles a human being with one exception. His entire body, excepting his hands, or paws, and feet are covered in glossy hair about 1 inch long. His forearm is much longer than a man's forearm, and he possesses extraordinary strength, as he will take hold of a stick and break it by wrenching or twisting it, which no man living could break in the same way. Since his capture he is very reticent, only occasionally uttering a noise which is half bark and half growl. He is, however, becoming daily more attached to his keeper, Mr. George Tilbury of this place, who proposes shortly starting for London, England, to exhibit him. His favourite food so far is berries, and he drinks fresh milk with evident relish. By advice of Dr. Hannington, raw meats have been withheld from Jacko, as the doctor thinks it would have a tendency to make him savage. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to summarise the rest of the article. It relates that the creature was first spied asleep near the railroad tracks by the driver of the train to Lytton. Thinking that he was seeing a man, the driver blew the signal for the brakes, and at this point the creature leapt up, gave a short bark, then attempted to scale the bluff surrounding the tunnel. The train having now stopped, the train's operators gave chase and succeeded in cornering the creature on a projecting shelf of rock. At this point the conductor climbed up to a point some 40 feet above Jacko, and succeeded in stunning the creature by dropping a rock on him. The crew then tied him up with bell rope, placed him in the baggage car, and took him to Yale. Here a large crowd had gathered who had heard of the beast's capture by telephone. However, they were unable to view the beast, as he apparently had been taken off at the station machine shops, where he was placed in the care of Mr. Tilbury. Not surprisingly, extensive argument has surrounded what this creature was. Grover Krantz, for example, argued that Jacko might well have been a juvenile Sasquatch. However, in my opinion, the body dimensions, behaviour and strength attributed to Jacko are all pretty much in line with a male chimpanzee. I'm pretty confident in that, speaking as someone who did the main university project on primates and spent most of their teenage years being obsessed with chimpanzees. It should also be noted that Jacko is never at any point mentioned to be bipedal in this story, and other aspects of the modern Sasquatch, such as its strong odour, are notably absent. As such, David Daegling has suggested that Jacko was simply an escaped primate from a sideshow or a circus. In favour of this argument, he points out that the finding of an escaped animal along the train tracks would make sense, as figures such as P.T. Barnum and George Bailey have used the railroads for transporting circuses with exotic animals for decades by that point. Grover Krantz would also attempt to invert this argument by arguing that P.T. Barnum, this is where it gets wild, P.T. Barnum could have bought Jacko and in fact exhibited him as the act Jojo the dog-faced boy, who was claimed to be a wild man from the Russian Kostroma forest. I don't want to be flippant, but this is a bit of a ridiculous claim. It is well established that the real Jojo the dog-faced boy was in fact a Russian man by the name of Fedor Jeftichu, who suffered from a condition known as hypertrichosis, which caused abnormal patterns of hair growth, particularly on the face. Jeftichu is also known to have spoken multiple languages. There are pictures available of him, and also of him with his father who had the same condition. And it's known that any barking and growling noises he made are thought to have been a part of his act suggested by Barnum. However, all of this, as interesting as it is, may also be something of a futile debate, as there is a serious argument to be made that all of this was just in fact a newspaper hoax. So 5 days after the initial story, the paper The Mainland Guardian issued the following statement. The what is it is the subject of conversation in town this evening. How the story originated, and by whom, is hard for one to conjecture. Absurdity is written on the face of it. The fact of the matter is that no such animal was caught, and how the colonist was duped in such a manner, and by such a story is strange, and stranger still, when the Columbian reproduced it in that paper. So the Columbian is another paper. I wasn't able to track down a copy of the Columbian's article, so I am going by the word of this article. The train of circumstances connected with the discovery of Jacko and the disposal of same was, and still is, a mystery. So according to, I think it's either David Dagling's account or from Abominable Science, the Columbian mentioned on the 12th of July that a gathering for the beast was well attended, but ultimately the beast himself was never exhibited, which, if true, raises further eyebrows. Beyond these reports, we also have no living eyewitness testimony. There's understandably, by the time Bigfoot researcher John Green attempted to follow upon it many decades later, no one was still alive who had been involved, and those that knew people involved stated they had heard the story at the time, but themselves had never seen the creature. So I think it's fairly unsurprising then that many Bigfoot skeptics have dismissed this whole affair, and it is routinely referred to as the Jacko hoax. So if you look this up on Wikipedia, it's referred to there as the Jacko hoax. So my final account that comes from the 19th century is one that has become frequently mentioned in connection with Bigfoot, and Crofty, I think this comes from the biggest historical name we've mentioned in connection with this podcast before. If you can think of a better one, enlighten me. But otherwise, Crofty, I am delighted to tell you that this rather bully account comes to us from none other than the 26th President of the United States, writer, politician, rancher, conservationalist, explorer, peacemaker, and warmonger, let's face it, Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, I think he is probably the biggest name we've had, and the only head of state so far, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we do something on UFOs, I think Jimmy Carter pops up there as well. But, well, we'll wait and see if we ever get round to doing more stuff on cryptids. So I described this there as a rather bully account, but I think I'm probably overstating it there. It's actually a bit of a grim account. This story was originally contained in Chapter 9 of the second volume of his 1893 book, The Wilderness Hunter, which is largely a memoir of his experiences as a big game hunter in North America. So, for a little historical context, after the death of his wife and mother on the same day in 1884, his wife died of Bright's disease brought on by giving birth. And I think his mother died of typhoid fever, I'm not quite sure. To cope with the understandable emotional devastation, Roosevelt spent 2 years working as a cattle rancher in what was then the Dakota Territory. It was during this period that he heard a story given by an old frontier hunter by the name of Bauman of a fatal encounter that he and a friend had had with a monstrous beast in what is now western Montana. So unfortunately, we don't know when or where he met Bauman, or when Bauman's claimed encounter actually took place. From the context of the tale, however, it seems to have taken place many decades before, and Roosevelt describes him as a young man at the time of the encounter. So I have summarized this account a little because it goes on for a while. According to Roosevelt, this encounter took place in the Bitterroot Mountains. Bauman and a partner were out trapping along a fork of the Salmon River, but having little luck in catching any prey, they decided to instead go to a more remote pass, for which was said to run a small stream along which could be found many beavers. Now, this pass was also said to have an evil reputation, as the previous year a hunter had been found to have been slain and half-eaten by some unknown creature there. Ignoring this warning, Bauman and his partner decided to head for the pass, stopping only to leave their mountain ponies behind when the terrain proved unfavourable. Upon arriving, they found plentiful sign of game amongst the mountain forest and decided to camp in a small glade by the stream before nightfall. After building a small lean-to for shelter and leaving their packs behind, they used the remaining sunlit hours to explore a little further upstream. Finding the dense forest hard to travel through, they decided to return back to the camp when dusk fell. Here, however, to their surprise, they found that something had rifled through their packs, scattering the contents, and had destroyed their lean-to. Not thinking much more of it, they presumed that it had been done by a bear. They rebuilt their lean-to, and reorganised their things for the night. Then, whilst Bauman was cooking their supper on a campfire, his partner went to inspect the creature's tracks, which led away down an old game trail. Coming back to the fire, his partner turned to Bauman and said, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." After first trying to laugh off the idea, Bauman himself went out and checked, and found they did seem to have been made by 2 paws, or potentially even by feet. Unable to tell for sure given the darkness, Bauman and his partner discussed whether these could in fact be human footprints, but eventually decided they could not be, and bedded down under their lean-to. At midnight, Bauman awoke to the strong smell of a wild animal in the vicinity. Spying a great body moving around at the mouth of their lean-to, he grabbed his rifle whilst he still lay in his blankets, and fired a shot at the creature. He assumed that he must have missed, for the creature turned and fled, crashing through the forest as it went. I think fairly understandably, the 2 trappers got no more sleep that night. I think if I just heard that creature, I probably wouldn't have gotten any more sleep that night.
Same.
Though they heard nothing more as they sat up around the fire. When the morning came, the 2 men went and checked the traps they'd put out, keeping close together, and spent the rest of the day putting out new ones. Returning to the camp that evening, they found that the creature had returned and destroyed the lean-to once again, then had thoroughly despoiled all their kit and bedding, which it had thrown around the meadow. Again, the ground was marked by its tracks, and it had clearly walked off on 2 legs along the side of the stream. Now somewhat unnerved, the 2 men rebuilt their camp, then gathered a great heap of logs which they used to light a larger fire. One or both of them then spent most of the night keeping guard around the fire until about midnight. It was then that the creature returned. So according to Bauman's account, it came down through the forest opposite their camp, across the stream, where it remained for an hour. In addition to the sound of the crackling of branches as it moved around, Bauman claimed it also occasionally gave out a long, harsh, grating moan. However, it did not approach the fire, and eventually left. Again, very understandably, in the morning the 2 trappers decided it was best that they leave, not just because of the strange creature, but because despite seeing plenty of signs of game on their way in, they had in fact caught very little. Going to retrieve their traps, they spent the morning with the unnerving feeling that they were being watched from the forest. Eventually Bauman volunteered to go and find their 3 remaining traps, whilst his partner returned to break down the camp. Finding 3 beaver in the traps, Bauman spent some hours preparing them, and found that by the time he had prepared the skins, the sun was, quote, uneasily low. Starting back, he walked through the forest, which he found disturbingly quiet, as there was no breeze to ruffle the branches. Finally arriving back at the camp, he shouted to his companion, only to receive no answer. The fire had gone out, and on spying their packs neatly arranged, Bauman stepped closer and shouted again. It was then that his eyes fell upon his friend's body, who was stretched out by a nearby spruce. The man's neck was clearly broken, and his throat bore 4 great fang marks. As best Bauman could tell, his companion had finished packing, and then sat down to await his return. At this point, the creature seems to have come up from behind him, still walking on 2 legs, then killed him by seizing his head and burying his teeth in the man's neck. Instead of eating the body, the creature apparently had celebrated its kill by rolling repeatedly over the body, romping around the campsite, and then had fled once more back into the woods, walking on 2 feet. So in the conclusion of this tale, Bauman abandoned everything except his rifle, and fled back to the meadow where they had left their ponies, and promptly rode through the night until he was far beyond the creature's reach. Despite being an older tale, this story is again something of a recent addition to the Bigfoot canon. The sources I found again credited writer Ivan Sanderson for including it in his 1961 book. I think I did also see one account that Renee Dowden was also the source of it. Whilst this is understandably often brought up by Bigfoot advocates as an early sighting and fatal encounter with the creature, I think it's important to note here that Roosevelt is dubious about how truthful this account is in his own work. He describes it as an impressive goblin story, and of Bauman himself, he says, "He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale. But he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore. So many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps, of the snow walkers and the spectres and the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths, and dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk, and it may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast, but whether this was so or not, no man can say." So firstly, I want to point out that was one sentence.
Hell of a sentence.
Yeah, I really do envy 19th century writers back when word economy just wasn't a thing. You could just go on and on and on and on in one sentence, and there's a lot of abuse of commas and semicolons in that particular sentence. I'm personally inclined to agree with Roosevelt's assessment of the story. I think it's a really good story, but as noted by Bigfoot advocate Peter Byrne, it should be pointed out that for all its ominous details, this story does still sound quite similar to a bear attack.
Yeah, and we've discussed before in episodes such as Spring-Heeled Jack about the psychology of seeing a horrific event and then very much amplifying it in your mind. So it is quite understandable that the man himself believed his story, even if it wasn't an accurate representation of what actually happened.
I think we're going to try and get into that a bit more towards the end of part 2. I think we're going to have a section where we're going to discuss some of the reasons why people believe in Bigfoot. I think we're also going to kind of talk about a lot of Bigfoot skeptics kind of throw up the argument of it's just a bear that was missighted. I don't think there's nothing to that argument, and indeed some species of bear are known to be able to stand on their back feet for short periods. And I think indeed the black bear is actually able to walk for some distance on 2 feet. I have seen footage of a black bear at a zoo doing that, for example. In addition, we should also probably note David Dagling's comment in his book that this account does also follow a very generically folkloric pattern of adventurers who ignore a warning not to tread in a place and who pay the price for their poor judgment. Okay, Crofty, so after a very, very long time, I can finally hand over to you, and I believe you're going to start talking about what we could kind of consider some of the early modern accounts of Bigfoot.
So, for my section, I'll be focusing on the first half of the 20th century and talking about the various encounters in the build-up to Bigfoot becoming a household name. Because we start to see scattered encounters from about the 1920s onwards, prior to the very famous event that we're saving for part 2. So, one event in the summer of 1924 can really be credited with being Bigfoot's first steps into the popular consciousness, as it were.
Oh no, not a pun.
Oh yes, plenty of them coming up, don't worry. And that event would later become known as the Battle of Ape Canyon. So on Sunday the 13th of July, 1924, the newspaper The Sunday Oregonian ran the headline, "Fight with Big Apes Reported by Miners." The article recounted the story that had been told by a party of 5 gold prospectors, the father and son Marion and Roy Smith, Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre and John Peterson, who encountered what they described as mountain devils on Mount St. Helens in Washington state. The short version of the report was that the group had been prospecting a claim by the Muddy River, downriver from Spirit Lake at the base of the mountain, where they saw a group of animals roughly 7 feet tall, estimated as weighing 400 pounds, covered in black hair and walking upright. Marion Smith fired at one of them with a revolver before the party retreated to the log cabin where they'd been staying. That night, the creatures attacked the cabin by throwing large rocks, damaging the roof and walls, and injuring Beck. The following day, the 12th of July, the prospectors then returned to Kelso, Washington, where they reported the encounter. The article gave very few other details. At first, it claims that the prospectors had found tracks of these creatures, from which they determined that the feet were 13 to 14 inches long, with 4 short, stubby toes, and that forest rangers and other prospectors had been finding similar tracks for years, but doesn't actually cite anyone who's made those claims. It also mentions that the ears of these creatures were about 4 inches long and stick straight up. So that's all the information given on the first day of reporting. Several decades later, the full story of the battle would later be told by Fred Beck in a short book written by his son, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, my impression of that work, Crofty, is that you could describe it appropriately with the words buck wild.
Yes, yeah. It's going to be a fun one to recount, but yeah, it's a bit of an odd one. So for the moment, I will stick to the further reporting by the Oregonian at the time, as the Oregonian would continue to run articles every day for the rest of the week as the story developed. So the following day, Monday the 14th, the Morning Oregonian ran a further article titled Party to Hunt for Mountain Devils. The paper reported that 4 forest rangers, Frank Heim, R.S. Bailey, Hal Lose, and C. Parker, would set out the next day on an expedition to the canyon in order to find traces of the animals that had been encountered and to attempt to get photos of any creatures matching the description. They also reported that Marion Smith had stated he intended to return later in the summer to hunt and kill one of the creatures and bring the body back to Kelso. The article then went on to report further details of the initial attack, which included that more than 200 rocks, some weighing as much as 30 pounds, had been thrown at the cabin. The article also claims that a fire was built inside the cabin to intimidate the animals, with a hole in the roof serving as a chimney, while the creatures outside were loudly pounding their chests in order to intimidate the party. Smith claimed in the article that the party did not fire back at the creatures at all. He also claimed that they counted at least 20 of the creatures outside, but the party merely stood guard until the attack ended at 2:30 a.m, at which point the creatures left, and the party began the hike back to the Spirit Lake Ranger Station. So, although the first 2 articles made the claim that forest rangers had previously seen tracks of these creatures, without naming any sources to back it up, the following day, the paper then ran a quote from the rangers based at the Spirit Lake Station, stating that they had never seen any tracks matching the description given by the prospectors. Additionally, 2 other groups of people nearby reported nothing unusual seen on those days. This included a party of 70 young men who had been camped within a mile of the encounter the previous night, who saw no sign of any unusual creatures. And also on the day of the alleged attack, a group of 5 men had met the prospectors at the cabin, and they would later set up their own camp some 500 feet or 160 to 170 meters away from the cabin, and they would stay up all night singing, and they saw and heard nothing of the attack. And this is probably the first point where the prospector's story really starts to fall apart, as I highly doubt that from less than 200 meters away, anyone could not notice 20 huge ape-like creatures throwing 15-kilogram rocks at a cabin while making enough noise to intimidate their target.
Yeah, like bellowing, beating their chests. Like, if you've ever seen a troop of chimpanzees go wild, it's like, yeah, you're hearing that from a couple of miles away, mate.
Yeah, that's it. You notice that if you're staying up all night, and if you're asleep, it wakes you up. So the same article also quoted the state's game warden, a Captain A.E. Bergdorf, and a member of the U.S. Biological Survey, Stanley G. Jowett, who both...
We're getting some interesting names today on this.
1920s America. These 2 also stated that there had been no prior evidence of any such creatures in the region. They also explained that the rocks falling on the cabin roof had a much more rational explanation, in that the location of the cabin was against quite a steep hill, and that a rockfall was perfectly plausible. However, none of these counterclaims deterred the Oregonian from further reporting on the story, as the same article did print very vague claims from Fred Beck that spirits he encountered when holding seances were somehow responsible, without giving any further context to that statement. At the time, at least.
Yeah, I think it's worth just quickly saying here, folks, we're not really going to go into the fringe attempts to explain Bigfoot as being some sort of spiritual or UFO-like being. However, we can't avoid it in this case.
Yeah, later on, Fred Beck will go into quite some detail, which I will summarise in a bit once we've got through the various Oregonian articles, as the Oregonian got plenty of column inches out of this one. So, all of these various claims that there was no evidence of the attack, and also Fred Beck's rather dubious story, did not stop the hunt for the creatures, and in fact the next day the Kelso police chief even got involved with the hunt. The following day, further reports from the Oregonian made the first connection between these creatures and Native American beliefs. So they ran an article on Wednesday the 15th by Georg Totsky of the Klallam Native American tribe, who explained that all of the tribes of the Pacific Northwest recognized the creature as a tribe known as the Siatic. Please forgive the pronunciation. He does mention other pronunciations in the article, but I'm not going to attempt any of those, especially from reading old, poor quality photocopies.
We've done enough damage.
Yes. So I'm sticking with Siatic, and I am very sorry if that's incorrect. I did search for the word and try and find a pronunciation guide, but according to Google, doesn't seem to exist. So I don't know. So according to Totsky, the Siatic were considered the skeleton in the northwestern Indian's closet, and their history was kept a secret because the white man would not believe the stories regarding them.
That's a great way of, not having to substantiate anything.
Yeah. Yeah. This tribe were said to have lived as far south as Mount Rainier, near the Washington-Oregon border, and as far north as Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Allegedly, members of the Siatic tribe were over 7 feet tall, with some reaching as much as 8 feet, with hairy bodies like a bear to protect them from the cold in the mountains where they lived. They're described as hunters who kill their prey with hypnotism, that they can use ventriloquism and throwing their voices to misdirect others, and that they are able to speak the languages of bears and birds, as well as the language of any Native American tribe in the Northwest. The tribe are also said to be known for playing practical jokes on other tribes and kidnapping their women. And I'm sorry if this sort of overlaps with a lot of what you've said, Charles, but I am basically going directly from what was reported at the time here.
Yeah. It's interesting to listen to this because, when you see reports of it, it's yeah, it was just some blokes claim they got in a battle with 8 men, and then no one mentions any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's it. There was a whole long article on the Oregonian that Wednesday. It goes into quite a bit of detail. So I'm summarising a bit here. So Totsky then described an encounter that was told to him by another member of the Klallam tribe, a Henry Napoleon, who, when tracking a deer that he had wounded in the wilderness near Duncan, British Columbia, he encountered a creature that he first thought to be a large bear. However, when he took aim, the creature spoke to him in his own language. The creature invited Henry to sit with him, and explained that as he was astral projecting at the time, Henry had been able to catch him unaware, otherwise he would not have been visible. And the article didn't say astral projecting, I just used that word rather than the longer description, but that's what it boiled down to, basically. The Siatic man invited Napoleon to the tribe's home, and so they travelled for several hours in the dark to an underground trail, which would then open up into a large cave that was supposedly their summer home, with their winter home being in caves elsewhere on Vancouver Island. The Sciatic explained to Henry that they were rarely seen because of a combination of special medicine that can render them invisible and also use of their hypnotic powers. So Henry stayed the night with the tribe before being led in the morning through the tunnels back to the village in which he'd been staying. Totsky also then tells of a much more violent encounter, which was related to him by his own grandfather, where his grandfather saw a village entirely wiped out by the Sciatics after the villagers had kidnapped one young Sciatic man in retaliation for the Sciatics stealing salmon from them. The prisoner escaped and fled to his people, and Totsky's grandfather warned that they would return to punish the Clallam, but he was just laughed at. So that night, the Sciatic then appeared and attacked the village and killed everyone there except for Totsky's grandfather's family, as they had all fled.
Seems like your typical morality tale.
Yeah, it does. Something to warn the grandkids not to go around kidnapping. So the following day, the Oregonian continued to report similar claims of encounters with and of the varying abilities of the Sciatics, with all of the Native Americans interviewed claiming that the hunt for the ape men would fail due to the extraordinary abilities of the Sciatics. And finally, on Friday, July the 18th, the Oregonian then ran the headline, "Tale of Gorillas Branded as Myth." So, two of the forest rangers who investigated the encounter, J.H. Huffman and William Welch, concluded that they had found nothing to substantiate the story. The one alleged footprint that they had found was quite easily shown to have been faked when Huffman himself made an identical print by simply pressing the knuckles and palm of his hand into the ground. Welch searched the canyon where a creature that Fred Beck claimed to have wounded had fallen, but he found no body or sign of anything that had been injured by a fall in the area. The cabin itself was searched, and while 4 large stones were found, they were concluded to actually have been deliberately placed, rather than have been thrown. And while the article doesn't comment on this, I should also note that 4 definitely doesn't constitute bombardment, as described in the original story, where it was alleged that it was more than 200 rocks thrown. So the Rangers then concluded their report by pointing out that the very same prospectors had actually been returning from the mountains with similar stories for about 5 years, and so were not credible sources, but the entire party did stick to their story.
This account just gets like uncritically put out there by people. And it's like,
yeah, and it gets more contradictory as Fred Beck tells his story, and it just gets crazier. So, so yeah, this bit's going to be fun, because in 1967, Fred Beck finally revealed further details of the encounter when he recounted the story to his son, which was published as the book I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, which, when you search for it, it shows up on Goodreads and it shows up on Amazon, but it's not actually available to buy. This is the account that was copied in full on the Bigfoot Encounters website. So, Beck's full account does contradict quite a lot of what was previously reported, and in places does contradict itself. He adds in various innocuous details, like the fact that he was suffering from a toothache, presumably to add some credibility to the story by adding more normal aspects to it. And he also adds certain details that he uses in order to claim that his eyesight was particularly keen. So at one point, he describes seeing wood chips being struck from tree trunks at 100 meters when they were firing at the creatures, which I know I wouldn't be able to see. And my eyesight has passed every eye test I've ever had.
Yeah, I have severe astigmatism, so I can't talk.
Whenever I do eye tests, I can get the bottom row of letters that you're not really expected to get.
Ooh, look at Mr. Fancy with his bottom row of letters over
yeah,
there.
Me with my perfect vision. It's just everything else that's failing about me. But yes, he makes these kinds of claims to sort of describe his own eyesight as being even better than mine. And he's very much trying to display his credibility before talking about some very incredible things. And it is important to note that even if he was being entirely truthful, he's telling the story nearly 40 years after the fact, and after so much sensational reporting around the subject that's been done, so his memory at this stage may not have been the most accurate. In the book, he also doesn't mention any names of his companions, apparently to protect their privacy, even though
it's already out there.
The Oregonians already put it out there. He refers to one important figure by the alias of Hank, which, cross-referencing with the Oregonian, I can assume is actually Marion Smith, the leader of the party. So he starts by describing the tracks that they found on the trek to the site of their gold claim. He states that they were up to 19 inches long and that no known animal could have made them. He also goes on to claim that for the first week of them working at the site, they were able to hear a shrill, peculiar whistling from 2 ridges on either side of the cabin in a sort of call and response pattern. And from the same directions, he describes a booming sound, which he says sounded like a creature hitting its chest. And it's after a week of hearing these sounds that he then tells of the first sighting, which he describes as follows. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring, about 100 yards from our cabin, to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away, on the other side of a little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree, and poked its head out from the side of the tree. And at the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that was quite a distance to see bark fly, but I saw it.
Okay then. Take your word.
Yeah. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall, with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it, running fast and upright, about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. So that already quite contradicts the claim that Marion Smith shot it once with his pistol, and that was it. So, after this encounter, the party all agreed to leave the first thing the following morning, as at the time that day it was too late to get back to their car before nightfall. So, they retreated to their cabin, and they didn't leave for the rest of the evening. Here, Beck describes the cabin as being sturdily built, with a fireplace fashioned out of rocks at one end, and with no windows.
Wait, then didn't they put a fire? Didn't they light a fire with an artificial chimney or something in the original account?
The chimney was just a hole in the roof, it said, but yes, they lit a fire to deter the creatures, allegedly, in the original account, but how they would see it from inside with no windows is a bit... not really sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure my original point is a contradiction, though, so I'll withdraw that.
I mean, it still does contradict there. If there's no windows, lighting a fire inside isn't a deterrent. So that was one thing I was going to note as a contradiction.
Ah, okay, cool.
He also claims that this cabin was visited by sightseers for years afterwards, until it burned down a few years prior to the book's release. Conveniently. So that night, the entire party slept until midnight, when they were awoken by a rock hitting the cabin wall, knocking a piece of the wall loose from between the logs. Through the slit that was left in the wall, Beck claims to have only been able to see 3 creatures, but it sounded like many more, which contradicts Smith's previous claim of counting at least 20. Beck then claims that the account of giant boulders being hurled through the roof was false, as there were no large rocks in the area, and the small ones didn't damage the cabin any further, which contradicts the actual 4 boulders found inside the cabin. As the creatures threw rocks, the party would fire back through the slit that had been created in the wall, but they would only fire back when the creatures were throwing rocks. This, Beck claimed, was his suggestion, so that the creatures would understand that they were only defending themselves. However, again contradicting Marion Smith's earlier claims that no shots were fired. Beck also describes an incident where one creature got close enough to stick a hand through the damaged wall and to try and grab a nearby axe, but one of them shot at the hand and it was withdrawn. The attack supposedly ended at dawn rather than 2:30 a.m. as previously claimed. And then the party immediately fled the cabin after the attack ended. As they fled, Beck spotted one last creature, which he shot at 3 times, causing it to fall 400 feet down the cliff. Though, as I say, the Oregonian reported no evidence of a body or signs of a fall.
Yeah, they also indicated that the unscalable cliff was not so unscalable.
Yeah. So yes, quite a lot of contradictions in this account. So, for the remainder of the book, which in print form I think was only about 22 pages.
Book is a generous term.
Yeah. Yeah, he calls it a book. It's described as a pamphlet on Amazon.
Right.
Yeah, and Goodreads has it saying it's 22 pages. For the remainder of the book, as the battle itself was only chapter 1 of 5, Beck then tries to claim that the big feet they encountered are actually supernatural creatures from a lower plane of existence. He describes psychic experiences that he allegedly had growing up as proof that he could always tell that the creatures were supernatural, before explaining that the reason that the party were even at this site was that they had been led there by the spirit of a Native American chief, which he simply called the Great Spirit, and by a female spirit who showed Beck a ghostly white arrow to follow that would lead them to their gold. At one point, one of the party expressed doubts that they would find gold and claimed that the Great Spirit had lied to them, at which point the spirit appeared and told them that they would find the gold, but they would not be able to take it. So then, in a very long-winded way, which I'm going to very heavily summarise, he explains that the spirits of Bigfoot were one reason they could never mine the gold in their claim. He explains that these creatures were a spiritual missing link between animal consciousness and human consciousness, who were able at times to manifest in the physical world from their own lower dimension, and this is why no bodies or physical evidence was ever found, and why no one would ever be able to capture a Bigfoot alive. So yeah, that's a very shortened version of his explanation, which has a lot of tangents about other spiritual encounters and multiple planes of existence that essentially makes it completely impossible to prove or disprove, and just relies entirely on taking Beck at his word. Whereas, if anything, to me it destroyed any remaining credibility that the encounter had. Yeah.
I mean, even in some skeptical accounts, Beck's other claims associated with the Battle of Ape Canyon just go unaired. It's just, some miners claimed that this happened and the papers didn't believe them, essentially. It adds another dimension to the credibility of that account by bringing in those statements.
Yeah, I can kind of understand why believers would leave that part out.
Yeah. So. I mean, that's kind of the crux of the problem, is it is dishonest to do so. So
yeah, that's it.
That's not a sign of good evidence. If you find evidence that's contrary to your hypothesis that Bigfoot exists, you don't just sweep it under the rug and hope no one mentions it. It's,
or anything that really strains the credibility of the witnesses as well.
Yeah, and that's going to be a recurring problem going forward.
Really is.
I know we came in here saying we didn't want to be flippant, but
it's difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult. There's a point where you have to face reality, unfortunately.
Yeah. Before we move on from Ape Canyon, I will mention one final addition that was made to the story many years later. So, in 1982, a retired logger named Rant Mullins of Toledo, Lewis County, would admit to the local newspaper, the Daily Chronicle, that he was behind the entire thing. So yeah, that's just taken all of Beck's credibility.
Oh yeah, is this the story? I don't want to spoil it. Is this the story about a group of boys, basically throwing rocks at the canyon?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right.
So I will say here, remember the name Rant Mullins. Keep it in the back of your mind. because it will come up again later. It's an important connection. So Mullins claimed that he and his uncle were returning from a fishing trip that day, and they and the rest of their group decided to scare the miners by rolling rocks towards them. He then claimed that he would perpetuate the legend when, about 4 years later, he carved a pair of giant feet out of green alder wood, and he and a friend would wear them to create tracks around the banks of the muddy river. And he is quoted as saying to the Daily Chronicle, "I tell you, people will believe just about anything."
Segue to...
Well, segue to a couple more stories from the 1920s, which emerged since then, in both of which describe travellers who were kidnapped by a family or an entire tribe of big feet, before we get on to the big one where Ramp Mullins pops up again. Both of these two accounts are of quite dubious origin. One encounter is a second-hand account from a priest, which was told to him by a member of the Nootka tribe of British Columbia during the time he spent among them in 1928. And the other encounter occurred in 1924, but wasn't made public until 1957, so I will tell the priest's story first. So, during his time among the Nootka tribe, Father Anthony Terrar of the Mount Angel Abbey in Oregon knew a tribesman by the name of Mukalat Harry, who was a trapper, whom the father described as a tough, fearless man of excellent physique. Harry would often spend weeks in the forest alone, which Father Anthony described as unusual. He describes the tribes of Vancouver Island as being a timid people who regarded the deep forests as the territory of Bigfoot, and so would never venture into the forest alone, except for Harry, who always went alone and feared nothing. So I don't have a date when Father Anthony actually recounted this particular story, although I've literally just realised as he said the word Bigfoot, that dates it in the 50s, so actually about the same time probably.
There's a finite life to the term Bigfoot.
Yes, as we've not mentioned its coining yet, that will come up later. So yes, that does actually date it as earliest 1957 as well. So ignore my thing about why I told this one first. So late in the autumn of 1928, Harry had made camp around 12 miles upstream from the mouth of the Conuma River, which is about halfway up the west coast of Vancouver Island. He had set up trap lines and had built himself a lean-to serve as his base camp. One night, he claimed, he was woken by a huge male Bigfoot, lifting him from his blankets and carrying him off into the hills while he was wearing only his underwear. The Bigfoot carried him to their camp around 3 miles away, depositing him under a high rock shelf surrounded by 20 or more big feet, male and female, adults and children, all of which watched him for some time while making no move to harm him. He did, however, see piles of bones lying around the campsite, and so claims he was scared that they were going to eat him. The big feet all watched him until late afternoon, even though all he did was simply sit by the rock wall, cold and mostly unmoving. Towards the late afternoon, their interest started to fade, and they went about their business, which Harry speculated was mainly gathering food. And so, without the tribe standing guard, he made a break for it, running downhill without looking back, bypassing his camp entirely, running the full 12 miles to where he'd stashed his canoe in nothing but his underwear. Father Anthony says that Harry reappeared at the village at 3 o'clock one morning, waking the village with a series of wild cries as he floated into the inlet in his canoe. Father Anthony found him freezing and exhausted in the bottom of his canoe, that he had paddled 45 miles through the night. It took him nearly 3 weeks to recover his health enough to even begin to tell the story. And after regaining his health, he never left the village, never went into the woods again, and never made any effort to retrieve his lost equipment, which would have been worth quite a lot to him at the time, all for fear of another encounter with the big feet.
Yeah, it's an interesting account. Again, it has the kind of flaw of being a second-hand account, as you say, likely given long after the time.
Yeah, that's it. So it's unfortunately a bit dubious.
Hmm.
The second account was at least told by the person who had the encounter, an Albert Ostman, although, like I say, he also waited about 30 years to tell it. In 1924, he was on vacation near Lund in British Columbia, about 100 kilometres north of Vancouver. He was travelling in order to search for a supposedly lost gold mine near Toba Inlet, for which he hired a local First Nations guide. The guide told him that the last white person to discover this mine would supposedly show up in local towns, freely drinking and gambling away his money, with no regard for how much he spent, before disappearing for a few days and returning with another bag of gold. However, one day he vanished and never returned, and was said to have been eaten by a Sasquatch. Ostman had never heard the name Sasquatch at this time, and his guide gave him the same description roughly that we've heard from Marion Smith's party. So 7 to 8 feet tall, hairy, leaving tracks as large as 2 feet in length. Ostman was apparently sceptical, believing that such creatures could only have existed thousands of years ago, but his guide insisted that, while few in number, Sasquatches did still exist. So Ostman first set up camp at the mouth of the inlet, and the guide departed the following morning, agreeing to return to meet Ostman at the same site in 3 weeks' time. The following day, after stashing some supplies for when he returned, Ostman set off inland and spent 4 days hiking northeast through the hills, stopping to prospect for gold in various spots each day. He found a good spot to camp where he rested for 2 days and spent the time prospecting around there, before continuing to travel for 2 more days and finding a site that he decided to make his permanent camp. He remained there for 3 nights before encountering the creature. Each day, he would find evidence that someone had been through his supplies in the night without waking him. At first, he thought that it would be porcupines, until he realised that his salt had been untouched, when supposedly porcupines always go for salt, and the fact that nothing was damaged told him that it wasn't bears. So, on the 3rd night, he awoke to find himself being carried in his sleeping bag on the back of an unknown creature. He was trapped within the sleeping bag, which was being held tightly closed by the way the creature was carrying him, but his pack, his rifle, and his knife were all in the sleeping bag with him.
That's, on the surface, you could say, oh, that's convenient, but if you're living in an area with bears, you probably want to keep that stuff close.
That's it. He has had 3 nights of something going through his stuff, so it does make sense that
it makes sense.
Keep things in his sleeping bag with him. Although he had his knife, he unfortunately couldn't reach it in order to cut himself free, so he simply had to let the creature carry him for several hours, which was mostly an uphill trek. The creature arrived at its camp while it was still dark, and deposited Ostman unharmed. Ostman could hear at least 4 creatures, all making unintelligible chattering noises, and it was then that he claims he knew he was among Sasquatches. He demanded to know what they wanted from him, but he got no response that he could understand. As it got lighter, he began to get a good look at them, and this is his description. It was getting lighter now, and I could see them quite clearly. I could make out forms of 4 people, 2 big and 2 little ones. They were all covered with hair and no clothes on at all. I could now make out the mountains all around me. I looked at my watch, and it was 4:25 a.m. It was getting lighter now, and I could see the people clearly. They looked like a family, old man, old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. The boy and the girl seemed to be scared of me. The old lady did not seem too pleased about what the old man dragged home, but the old man was waving his arms and telling them all what he had in mind. So the creatures didn't restrain him in any way. They didn't prevent him from eating his supplies, and they made no attempt to harm him. And in fact, when the adult female gathered food, she did give some to Osman. So over the next few days, when Osman was stuck there, he noticed that the young Sasquatches were quite curious about him, and that the adult male was interested in his tin of snuff. So Osman described their activities, claiming that everything that the family did was for a reason and that no time was wasted. If the parents weren't searching for food or eating, they were always resting, while the children were always doing some sort of exercise, such as climbing. Osman couldn't figure out what they wanted with him. There was, like I said, there was no indication that he was a prisoner or that he was intended as food. They just simply left him to his own devices. The family didn't stop him from making coffee in his coffee pot, from making a fire, from cooking his own food, or from chewing his snuff, and they made no attempt to take his gun from him. When he first showed the family that the snuff was for chewing, the adult male then grabbed the box from him and just ate a large handful. After a minute, his eyes rolled back and he looked sick, and he grabbed the cold coffee can and drank from it, but this only made him worse and he began to squeal. At this point, Osman used this distraction, grabbed his pack, grabbed his rifle, and made a break for it. The mother, seeing what had happened, went after him, but she fled back to the shelter of the camp after a warning shot from the rifle. So Osman found himself in a canyon, managed to quickly get his bearings, and set off south, claiming that he made 3 miles in record time before climbing a ridge out of the canyon. He then got his bearings by identifying Mount Baker, turned towards it, and carried on until mid-afternoon with no sign of pursuit. After a brief rest, he carried on south until nightfall, camped for the night, and then the next day spent 8 hours walking until he found a team of loggers who directed him back to the inlet, and from there he got the boat to Vancouver. So, as I mentioned, this encounter was not reported to the press at the time, and it would take 33 years for Ostman to come forward. By complete coincidence, Ostman told the British Columbia newspaper The Province of this encounter in May 1957, which was the same year that the town of Harrison Hot Springs in British Columbia was generating quite a lot of publicity by attempting to secure funding for a Sasquatch hunt as part of the British Columbia Centennial celebrations. So this is probably one of the biggest factors to cast doubt on Ostman's story, as it's a bit too convenient that such a detailed encounter will be publicised right when such a campaign was happening in a town that was only 100 to 150 kilometres southeast of the alleged encounter.
Yeah. There's also some like inherent problems with the story, like if this family of big feet, as you so delightfully put it, if this family had no interest in eating him or using him for any purpose, why did the male collect him and bring him home?
Yeah, there's no sense to it whatsoever, really.
Why did he wait? I know his argument was that he didn't use his gun because he thought it'd anger the big male, but like, why didn't he just shoot the big male?
Yeah, and if they don't want to eat him or keep him prisoner, why did they just sort of leave him to his own devices rather than try and communicate with him?
Why didn't he leave immediately when he saw he wasn't held prisoner?
Yeah, there's
yeah,
a lot of holes there. And yes, I am using Big Feet as the plural based on Odo Proudfoot in the Fellowship of the Ring, claiming that the plural of Proudfoot is Proud Feet. And this was the last episode I ever expected to get a Tolkien reference.
Well, you know, big hairy feet. It's on brand.
Yeah. Now that I've mentioned the town of Harrison Hot Springs, I should also make a brief mention of their claim as the Bigfoot capital of the world. So, while British Columbia and the bordering state of Washington to the south are the main settings for most of the Bigfoot encounters in the first half of the 20th century, the accounts from the region of Fraser Valley, where Harrison is located, don't really fit with the Bigfoot we know today, as these are all of the accounts that you, Charles, have described in your first section. So the main claim to fame in this regard for the town of Harrison itself is that it was the hometown of John W. Burns,
Yeah. Yeah, the guy who collected, for context, because it's been, by my count, 14 hours since we mentioned it. For context, the guy who coined the term Sasquatch.
Yes. And after the term Sasquatch began to be applied to these ape-like creatures that we now associate with the word, rather than the idea of a human tribe, I can only find a total of 2 accounts of Sasquatches around Harrison or around the wider Fraser Valley region. These accounts are barely anything. Only one of them predates the publicity of the Sasquatch hunt in 1957. The other one is from 2004.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, the first one from the mid-1940s is simply 2 sentences with no citation of the original report, as I got it from BigfootEncounters.com. And it simply states, a Chehalis First Nation fellow named Henry Charley reported to J.W. Burns, a resident of the Fraser River Valley, that a Sasquatch chased him a mile down the road.
Yeah, that's that was in the article I mentioned at the beginning.
Oh, sorry, am I repeating you?
Really, let me just check. What's his name? That might be confusing a few things, because the guy in my story is called Charlie Victor.
Ah, right. So yes, this may be a mistaken version of your earlier account, or maybe a separate one, I'm not sure.
In his original account, basically, it's Peter Williams who was chased, as far as I'm aware. But he did have, there are like a couple of different encounters in that particular article.
Yeah, so it's quite a similar account, a bit dubious, and not clear whether it is referencing the human tribe Sasquatch that we talked about, or whether now the name is becoming more applied to the ape-like creatures, whether it's referencing one of those. But that's the only account at the time that I can find that you haven't already mentioned that's in the Fraser River Valley. And yeah, no, apart from that the Sasquatch easily kept pace with the bicycle, there's no further details at all. And the only other report I can find from that area isn't even a sighting, it is just a vocalization that was heard in 2004 in the woods nearby. This lack of encounters hasn't stopped the Harrison Hot Springs Tourism Board from using the Bigfoot Capital claim to sell the town, which did make looking into any verified accounts from around the region quite difficult, as you get through several pages of Google, which is just tourism information. And I will say that a quick Google image search tells me that it's quite a beautiful region and that it's well worth visiting for the scenery. So I'm not trying to harm Harrison's economy by saying any of this, just maybe a bit more accurate advertising.
Yeah. What we're saying is give us a free paid trip and we'll recant everything we say.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. If that works, it'd be brilliant. Could use a holiday. So, before I hand back over to you, Charles, we will come to the one final encounter that I'll discuss this episode, which takes place at a location that will be very familiar to anyone who knows anything about Bigfoot history, Bluff Creek in California. Rather than a direct encounter, the main body of this story is actually the first example of a phenomenon that would come to define the modern Bigfoot in more ways than one, and that this is the first documented Bigfoot tracks. So while the forest rangers and miners at Washington did describe tracks as part of the encounter at Ape Canyon, it is at Bluff Creek in 1958 that we first find Sasquatch tracks that would be observed by a third party and properly investigated. In the spring of 1958, the construction company owned by Ray Wallace was building a road near Bluff Creek in Humboldt County, which was expected to be finished by autumn that year. During the spring, there were scattered reports of large humanoid footprints being made around one of the work sites, and later in the summer, more footprints were found at a second work site. So in October that year, after finding his digger surrounded by these tracks on several occasions, the operator Jerry Crew made a cardboard outline of one of the footprints and took it to a local tracker, hunter and taxidermist in town by the name of Bob Titmus. Titmus couldn't identify any creature from the cutout, so he instructed crew in the method of making a plaster cast of the footprint. Upon seeing the 16-inch human-shaped foot plaster cast, Titmuss and crew then reported the story to the Humboldt Times, which ran a front-page article with a photo of crew holding up the cast. And it was in this article that the name Bigfoot would be coined by the reporter Andrew Genzoli. The story then quite rapidly spread across America and Canada, with the British Columbia newspaper The Province making the connection to the Sasquatch. Genzoli's article asked the question, are the tracks a hoax, or are they the tracks of a huge but harmless wild man travelling through the wilderness? Can this be some legendary-sized animal? So, as well as the name, this article was the first to describe a major characteristic of the modern Bigfoot as being huge but harmless, in contrast with the ape men of Mount St. Helens and the alleged cannibals of Vancouver Island.
Yeah, this is kind of the moment where we see the modern image of Bigfoot start to be made.
Yes, indeed. However, this is also the moment where we start to see a lot of controversy regarding whether they are real or a hoax, as by the 14th of October, the main suspect behind these prints was Ray Wallace himself, which was fueled by Wallace's reputation as a prankster and by the fact that none of the tracks appeared during the month in which Wallace had been away on a business trip. The Humboldt Sheriff's Department had even contacted Wallace and were requesting that he meet with the sheriff and explain his joke, although Wallace denied all of these accusations. The allegations don't seem to have been properly pursued much further for two reasons, which were reported by the Humboldt Standard on the 15th of October. Firstly, two workers reported seeing the creature crossing the road ahead of them while they were driving. They described Bigfoot as being 8 to 10 feet tall, walking upright like a man, covered in hair, swinging long arms, and crossing the road in 2 bounding leaps. And the tracks on this road that they then found were described as matching the prints found by Jerry Crew. The same day, reporters confirmed that the original footprints were actually across the county line in Del Norte County, and so were not in the Humboldt Sheriff's jurisdiction. So while the Del Norte Sheriff expressed concern and claimed that he would investigate as soon as possible, he did say, when questioned by the paper, that it's a difficult position to reach from this end of the line, and I can't find any further reporting of the Del Norte Sheriff's Department questioning Wallace, so while journalists would continue to debate whether Wallace was behind these prints, there doesn't seem to have been any further investigation by the authorities. More reports of Bigfoot tracks at Ray Wallace's work sites would continue well into the 1960s. Wallace himself would claim in 1960 that he had captured a live Bigfoot and would offer to sell the creature to researchers for $1 million. However, after weeks of negotiations for this, he conveniently had a change of heart and claimed to have released the creature back into the wild.
Yeah, very convenient.
Yeah. But still, even after this, he would claim that he would regularly see a passing Bigfoot at his work sites, even saying that I would sit in my pickup and toss apples out of the window to him. He never did catch an apple, but he sure tried. Which is a nice little quote, but again, a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I'm just kind of sat here in suspense because I know the ending.
So yes, if all this seems too convenient, that all of the tracks appeared around Wallace's work sites, all the findings and sightings were by Wallace's employees, Wallace's family, or by Wallace himself, that would be because it is too convenient. In 2002, upon Wallace's death, his family came forward with a set of wooden feet, admitting that Wallace would wear them to plant tracks as a hoax, and had continued to do so for many years. So, while for many this was considered concrete proof that the Bigfoot of Bluff Creek was a fake, with some reporters declaring that Bigfoot is dead. Some researchers and enthusiasts were insistent that the only proof was that some of the tracks were faked.
Yeah, I think, didn't they specifically say the fake feet held up by his son in the photo only matched some?
Yes, they did.
Yeah, ignoring that they actually found several sets. And indeed, if you Google them, you can find the photo of them all together very easily.
Yeah, and we're getting to how all that came about, don't worry.
Mm-hmm.
So the wooden feet that were originally produced were compared to casts that were made by Jerry Crew and were found not to be a match, which was a main reason that these researchers and enthusiasts were still claiming some of the feet were real. However, there were other less famous casts from the work sites that were a match for these feet provided by the Wallace family, and as you say, many more feet would be produced over the years. But the proponents of the idea that the Bluff Creek Bigfoot was real don't seem to have seriously considered the idea that maybe Wallace had multiple pairs of feet at the time.
Yeah, it's a curious omission. I mean, I've also heard a few advocates talk about how trustworthy and, by all accounts, good of a man Jerry Crews was. So it's surprising that a man who apparently was an upstanding member of the community would go along with a hoax or indeed be involved in conceiving it. There's a couple of things you can say in response to that. One is that Jerry Crews, for all his reported attributes, was still Ray Wallace's employee.
Yeah, he kind of wanted to keep his job, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the second point is, it's not necessary really that Jerry Crews had to know.
No.
He could very well have been the butt of the prank by Ray Wallace. I mean, by all accounts, as you say before, he originally brought the story of the feet to wider attention just because he was frustrated that no one believed him.
Yeah. That's it. And there are quite a lot of other assertions around the various events, both to support the idea that Wallace's crew were being honest about and just not in on what was going on, but also assert that they were in on it and helping him. There's a lot of different reasons, both why Wallace would fake it or why it couldn't have been a fake, which I will go into now. So, firstly, we have the testimony of Ray Wallace's brother, which supporters claim is proof that it couldn't have been a hoax. So, Wallace's brother, Wilbur, claimed that one morning he arrived at the site to find heavy equipment had been moved around, including 50-gallon drums of diesel, 700-pound tyres, and large steel culverts, which had all been randomly thrown around the site. The culverts had also been cut from their bundles of 4, and the thick steel cables that had been holding the bundles together had been dumped a considerable distance uphill from the site. So, proponents of the Bigfoot explanation claim that there is no way any human would be capable of doing such a thing, so it must be the 10-foot-tall creature that made the footprints. But they never seem to make any mention of whether or not a construction worker or workers who are operating cranes and other heavy machinery could have moved the supplies, which seems a much simpler explanation.
I mean, an even simpler explanation is that we're trusting the testimony here of the alleged prankster's brother.
Yes, indeed. The next claim to support the idea that it was real is that the detrimental effect on Wallace's business from these events prove that Wallace must have had nothing to do with it. Wallace himself used this defense when accused, claiming that 15 employees had quit their jobs out of fear after the discovery of the footprints, and that he's not foolish enough to sabotage his own business. If Wallace did fake the prints, we'll never know his reasoning now, but over the years since the prints were found, there's been a lot of debate about why he would do such a thing, even at a risk to his own business. So another former employee, John Aumann, claimed that the original footprints were meant as a deterrent to thieves, as these thieves would attempt to steal tyres from the construction vehicles in the night, and that when the prince started to attract attention, Wallace kept quiet out of fear that he would get in trouble with the sheriff. To me, this entire explanation sounds ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah,
thieves would barely notice the prince in the night. There's no reason for Wallace to not privately explain this to the sheriff, as deterring thieves is also in the best interests of the sheriff's department.
there's also, I think it's either in the Abominable Science book or David Dagling's book, it's discussed Ray Wallace, by all accounts, was a subcontractor working on that site. He wasn't, like, directly responsible for its completion.
Yeah.
That's the claim in one of those books, anyway. I don't know how much that actually relates to it.
It relates a bit more to the next reason. But first, I will say that those on the Bigfoot is real side of the debate do have something to say about the thief deterrent explanation. In that they use the fact that some workers actually slept at the site, and so they would have either noticed and been able to apprehend thieves themselves, or they would also have noticed and been able to apprehend any hoaxers who were approaching the vehicles.
And presumably Bigfoot himself, if they were sleeping on the site.
That's the thing. They would conveniently have noticed thieves and hoaxers, but no mention that they would have noticed Bigfoot. So, yeah, it's a bit of a leap of logic either way.
Yeah.
Another explanation as to why Wallace would sabotage his own business, as you say, him being a subcontractor being part of this, is that the work was supposedly behind schedule and in danger of not being completed. And so, by scaring some of his crew and by creating the media circus around it, he then had grounds to request an extension to the deadline due to the unavoidable disruption of work, but also could try and salvage a bit of his reputation as a subcontractor, in that he had external factors to blame for having to go back on the contract.
I mean, that kind of relies on the idea that he had some sort of prescient knowledge that this was going to cause a big publicity thing.
Yeah, that's it. It relies on Jerry Crew being in on it, and the plan being, let's go to the press and let's kick up a media circus.
I don't think that's a valid point against the idea that it was Bigfoot, really. I think it's a stretch, that one.
That's it. It's sort of used by both sides in that, yes, this is why Wallace would do it, but the fact that it required Wallace to have planned the whole media circus and everything is used by people supporting Bigfoot as proof that Wallace wouldn't have done that. So,
yeah. Anyway, we're going through these circular arguments now. That always accompany these cases.
That's it. I'm afraid there's a lot of them. So there's another one where Wallace at one point admitted to Bigfoot hunters that he himself had made the tracks using fake wooden feet. However, when he didn't produce the feet, the hunters were undeterred. He would later claim that all of this was a lie that he had told out of concern for Bigfoot's welfare, as these hunters were experienced bear hunters with hunting hounds. So he then claims that he commissioned the feet after the fact to show to the hunters and to stop them after they'd first disbelieved him, and this then led to him being reported to the sheriff. The truth of that claim is further muddied when we hear of how Wallace claims to have got these wooden feet, as he commissioned them from none other than Rant Mullins of Toledo, Lewis County. Mullins would years later admit that he made feet for Wallace, as well as when he admitted to the Mount St. Helens footprints, but he claims that the first feet he made for Wallace wasn't until 1969.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's, again, a lot of claims that don't quite match up, so it's difficult to figure out where the truth comes from.
That is one that I noticed over the course of reading this, was that is sometimes glossed over a bit by Bigfoot skeptics, I think, that it's kind of just like presumed that Rant Mullins was just lying when he said that.
That's it. I mean, there's no reason really for Rant Mullins to lie about the dates, when he's admitting to being behind a lot of the Ape Canyon events. So there's no reason why he wouldn't just admit that he made some feet in 1958.
I mean, this is a stretch, but it's possible that those were the first set, and it's just actually quite obvious when there are already stories of Sasquatch in the local area thanks to the Sasquatch hunt publicity. It's not a big stretch for someone just to make some wooden feet.
Yeah, and
then Ralph Moran's could have done it later. It's a bit of a stretch of a theory, that one.
Yeah, and there are also claims that Ray Mullins lost the original Mount St. Helens feet. Somebody else had them for 20 years or more, and so may even be the original Mount St. Helens feet.
Yeah, I think this is the point where we put this account to bed, because it's getting into very murky territory.
That's it. I have the final claim that Bigfoot supporters use in an attempt to discredit Wallace and discredit the Wallace family, which is, rather than the origin of the feet itself, the question of how can a human walk in such large carved wooden feet and create footsteps that are wide enough apart for a 10-foot tall humanoid. So Don Buswell, who was also of Toledo, Lewis County, and who had worked with Mullins on planting the Mount St. Helens prints, claimed that he was the one who helped Ray Wallace make the prints. When he was interviewed by the Lewis County Chronicle, he said that he would put the feet on and hang on to the back of Wallace's pickup while Wallace drove slowly through the site, taking large steps as he went. And in describing the results, he said, "I tell you, they are eerie even if you make them yourself. You look back and you see them and they're kind of weird." The famous Bigfoot researcher Jeff Meldrum, who we've mentioned before, was not convinced by this story. He claimed in his book that because another member of the Wallace family couldn't replicate this feat, pun intended, when asked to on camera, this proves that it was impossible.
Yeah, that's a stretch, Jeff. Like, because another guy can't do it doesn't mean the original guy can't do it.
That's it. He's a respected scientist in his field, but this is the least credible argument that I've read.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will say is, obviously, we don't have positive proof that the other guy can do it, it sounds like. But, yeah, I'm not sure the reasoning that's going on there.
That's it. I mean, if one of the Wallace family being unable to do such a stunt on command is proof that the prints must have been made by Bigfoot, the fact that I can't skateboard without falling flat on my face proves that Tony Hawk is an alien. Which, having seen his Twitter, I'm sure he'd go along with that conspiracy theory, but it's about as ridiculous. That's the best analogy I can give you. So yeah, this all seems very convoluted and confusing to our listeners. Don't worry, people on both sides of the argument see it that way as well.
Yeah.
Proponents of the hoax explanation claim that because there's so many contradictory stories and that all of the evidence leads back to Wallace, and everybody claiming to have seen Bigfoot or found the feet can't keep their stories straight, that confirms that it was all fake. But proponents of the Bigfoot is real explanation claim that all of the contradictory explanations for why Wallace would fake the footprints are evidence enough that it's not a hoax.
Okay.
That's it. The fact that just how contradictory it all is seems to be enough to convince both sides. It's really impossible to get any answer out of any of it, to be honest with you.
I mean, that's the sort of situation where I see a debate to be hopelessly contaminated, to be honest.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And it would just get more and more crazy over the years as tracks would appear up the entire west coast, further inland, like I've said before, as far east as Arkansas, where, because by 2002, a grandnephew of Wallace, a Todd McKinley, would go on to admit that all of these tracks were done by Wallace's nephews, all of whom had been recruited by Wallace at various times and provided with sets of wooden feet. And so By this point, pretty much the entire family claimed knowledge of Wallace's hoaxes. The newspapers, as I say, were reporting Bigfoot is dead. But none of this would stop claims that Bigfoot was real. But that's a discussion for next episode. So, at this point, we've discussed most of the major Bigfoot events prior to 1960, with one exception, which, for reasons that will become clear, we've left this story until the end of part 1, even though it is chronologically before the Bluff Creek footprints. And so I will hand back over to you, Charles, to bring the episode to a close.
Okay, thank you, Crofty. So we previously talked about the two accounts dating from the 1920s, in which it was claimed that individuals were abducted by various Sasquatch communities or families. We have left one out so far, and as Crofty said, there's good reason, and the timing of when this claim was made adds another complicating factor to both the Bluff Creek footprints and also to Albert Ostman's account, and to another account, a much more famous account that we will discuss at the beginning of our next episode. So this account comes to us from a sworn affidavit given to Bigfoot researcher John Green in 1957 by a hunter named William Rowe. Now, according to Rowe, he had an encounter with what he claimed to be a female Sasquatch that took place in October of 1955, although it would be 2 more years before any surviving account we know of given by him was published. So on the day of the sighting, Rowe claimed that he had been working on the highway near a place called Tete Guane Cache for about 2 years at that point, when one day he decided to climb 5 miles up Mika Mountain to an old deserted mine, just quote, for something to do. Around 3 p.m. he came in sight of the mine and was entering a clearing when he saw what he thought was a grizzly bear about 75 yards away, partially concealed in the bush on the other side. He drew his rifle, but said he didn't want to shoot it as he had no way of getting out. After he had observed it for a while, the creature suddenly stood up, and he realized that it was no bear. So this is the exact description that he included in the signed affidavit. My impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to toe with dark brown silver-tipped hair. As it came closer, I saw by its breast that it was female, and yet its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's, and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionally than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front, and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked, it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see grey-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands, it pulled the branches of bushes towards it, and stripped the leaves from its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly about the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see its teeth were white and even. The shape of this creature's head somewhat resembled another racial epithet for a black person. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther from its nose, but the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of its face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and that on its face was much shorter. Its ears were shaped like human ears, but its eyes were small and black like a bear's. And its neck was also unhuman, thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. After he observed the creature for some time, Rose states that it apparently must have gotten his scent, for it turned and looked directly at him. According to Rowe, there was a look of amazement on its face, and it backed up a few paces, then turned and walked away rapidly, pausing only to watch him for a moment over his shoulder. Does that sound a little familiar, Crofty?
It does indeed. Though, if listeners aren't sure where we're going with this, they're going to have to wait until next time.
So at this point, Rowe claimed he aimed his rifle at the creature, but was overcome with the impression that what he was aiming at was in fact a human being, and that he would never forgive himself if he killed it. He also claimed to have heard stories of the Sasquatch, explicitly describing them in their earlier version as giant hairy Indians, and thought that this might have been one of them. So, this account occupies an interesting place. It was thought for a long time that there was no evidence of this account having predated the Bluff Creek footprints, and as a result they couldn't possibly have influenced whatever creature could potentially have been hoaxed there. Indeed, this is one of the big problems that also hangs over Albert Ostman's story that Crofty related earlier, as he waited, over 30 years to tell anyone about it, and he didn't actually come forward to tell anyone until he heard about William Rowe's account. Which again, in addition to the Sasquatch hunt that you mentioned, really damages his credibility.
Yeah.
However, it is now quite clear that William Rowe's account does predate the Bluff Creek incident narrowly. However, it does not predate the Sasquatch hunt. So that still is kind of an open factor as to whether that came to influence Rowe's story. So Rowe's account was published in a relatively complete fashion that does highly resemble that given in the affidavit, in an article in the paper The Province. Notably, that same issue also includes extensive discussion of the ongoing Sasquatch hunt, including the detail that Renee Dahinden had been appointed to head it. We didn't really go out much into the details of that hunt previously when Crofty discussed it. The basic conclusion I got from looking around the sources was that it didn't really amount to anything. Obviously, no sightings or attempts to capture the creature were actually made.
And they didn't even get the funding they requested to actually run any events for it either. So
yeah, exactly. So William Rowe's account is interesting because it could potentially be an inspiration point for the Bluff Creek footprints, although we've no way of proving that. What's also interesting about his account is, as noted by Daniel Luxton and Donald Profero in Abominable Science, there are a lot of uncertainties around his account. So the biggest of these by far is that we actually know almost nothing about the man who gave it. Whilst Rowe provided John Green with the sworn account I quoted above, it seems at no point did either Green or any other cryptozoologist actually speak to or meet Rowe in person. So according to John Green, he had wanted to do this, but, quote, by the time I'd wanted to, he had moved to Alberta. I don't know who might have spoken to him in person. As a result, it also seems that no one was ever able to go to the site to verify his description of the area, as by the time Green started to write his book and wanted to investigate further, Rowe had already died. What makes things worse is that Green was also apparently unable to find anyone who had ever heard the story before the news of the Harrison Springs Sasquatch hunt had made the news, or any information that corroborates Rowe's claim that he had been present in the area of the sighting in 1955. The result is that if we are to believe this account, we have to go on Rowe's word that this happened, that he chose 2 years not to mention it to anyone, and then he conveniently went to the press after a Sasquatch-related event was already being publicly discussed. Now, the fact that both Rowe and Ostman signed sworn affidavits is usually made like a big deal of by Bigfoot advocates, like they put their names to sworn oaths. In Abominable Science, it's argued that these affidavits actually had no legal repercussions if it turned out that the swearers were lying. I have read through William Rowe's affidavit. There doesn't appear to be any mention of any legal penalties if he breaks it, and also this affidavit is highly unlikely to have been used in any actual ongoing legal case, so I'm not sure it would have carried any potential consequences in the form of perjury.
Yeah, what criminal activity could this affidavit have been involved with for it to ever be questioned in a court, is the thing.
There's a lot surrounding William Rowe's account, and we'll get into a certain someone, in addition to possibly Bluff Creek, who may well have been inspired by it during his own encounter with a supposed Sasquatch. Hey folks, it's Charles here in post. I just want to go a little bit more in depth here about possible connections between the William Rowe sighting and the famous Patterson-Gimlin film that I was heavily implying here in order to kind of set up a bit of a cliffhanger for part 2. So, in the time since the audio version of this podcast first came out, a few people have got in contact with me to say that they think that the comparisons between the William Rowe sighting and the later Roger Patterson film might be a bit of a reach, specifically referring to the idea that Patterson might have been inspired by the idea of a Sasquatch walking away and looking over its shoulder. In particular, some people are pointing out that that's probably a reasonable response of a primate being suddenly caught unawares and retreating, where they would look over their shoulders to keep an eye on the creature they were trying to flee from. So that's fair enough. I think I probably read a bit too much into that. I originally took this theory from Daniel Loxton and Donald R. Profero's book, Abominable Science, and I'm not trying to deflect anything onto those guys at all. I just think that I maybe didn't critically assess this claim in the way I should have. So that's fair enough. I'm going to roll back and say I don't think that that specific aspect of the encounter was probably an inspiration to Roger Patterson. However, as we will discuss in part 2, if we're working for the moment under the theory that Roger Patterson's film was a fake, which is not something we're going to presume in our discussion, then I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the William Rowe encounter could have inspired a potential hoax surrounding the Bluff Creek incident. As, for example, Roger Patterson wrote about William Rowe's encounter in his book and drew various sketches alongside that book that highly resemble the creature that ended up appearing on the Patterson-Gimlin film. So I hope that clears a few things up, and as I say, we'll go into it a little bit more in part 2. Alright, folks. Thank you for listening. This is a really, really long one by our standards, so hopefully part 2 won't be quite as long-winded. This might be the longest standalone episode, despite also being a two-parter.
It feels like it.
Yeah. I melted about 2 hours ago, so I'm going to go, much like Odo from Deep Space Nine, and reconstitute myself back into the shape of a man. Crofty, I presume you're also going to do the same.
Yeah. Or just die, I don't know.
Yeah, probably the easier route at this point.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll be back maybe in a couple of weeks with part 2.
Yeah, stay tuned.
All right. See you later.